This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning for our audience worldwide. Good morning. We begin with our top story, an attack on the former president, Donald Trump.
If you want to really see something that said, take a look at what happened.
America coming within just an inch of a very different conversation this morning. The following picture will likely be the defining image of this election. The president, his fist raised, blood pouring down his right cheek after a bullet pierced the upper part of his right ear. Trump now heading to a very different RNC, telling the Washington Examiner, quote, "This is a chance to bring the whole country, even the whole world together. The speech will be a lot different than it would have been just 2 days ago." In a late-night Oval address, President Biden also pushing for unity.
While we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're our fellow Americans. We must stand together. The power to change America should always rest in the hands of the people, not in the hands of would-be assassins.
Our team coverage starts right now with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie alongside Bloomberg's Courtney Rosen. Anne-Marie, what a weekend.
Absolutely, Jonathan. It's an inflection point in American history, but also inflection points for both of these campaigns. For the Trump campaign, as you said, Donald Trump sitting down with the Washington Examiner after that assassination attempt saying, honestly, the speech is going to have to change now. He's going to want to bring and talk about unity and how he could potentially unite the country after this attack. Also, remember, as soon as today or at some point this week, we will get his VP pick. Was what happened over the weekend in Pennsylvania change how he thinks about this potential vice presidential candidate? And then for the Biden campaign, it's going to be about how they talk about the former president. Does that tone have to change? We already see President Biden pulling back on some campaign ads, pulling them off TV. We also see him deciding to halt a stop he was supposed to have today. He's still going to be sitting down with Lester Holt of NBC and then taking off this evening for Nevada. But how does he communicate his campaign? We heard from him yesterday saying when it comes to democracy, we should be debating things at the ballot box, not with bullets.
Courtney, we have plenty of questions about just what went wrong over the weekend, how something like this could happen. And it'll be the focus of this particular program throughout this morning. But with you, I'd like to talk about how these campaigns are going to change, both for the sitting president, Joe Biden, and the former president, Donald Trump. Just what kind of changes are you expecting?
What's important to remember here is that political violence was central to the reason that President Biden ran in 2020. You'll remember he talks quite often about how the violence at the rally in Charlottesville in 2017 prompted him to run for office again. It was a similar message last night that we were hearing, a message of unity, a message of promoting and saving democracy. And so we should expect that to continue throughout the week with a brighter spotlight on it, given what happened over the weekend. With President Trump, we're expecting a message as he's previewed of unity. Now that contrasts heavily to the image you were showing earlier of him with his fists pumped in the air. You see him in the videos mouth the word fight. And so it remains to be seen what the actual message will end up being. But so far, what he's saying is that he will project unity at the convention in Milwaukee this week.
Courtney, what do you think this means for his VP pick?
It's a lot more of a heavy choice, right? We saw bad things can happen. I would think that he is thinking about that. He's thinking about who could take his place should there be a need to. But we still don't know who he's going to pick, right? And usually we would know much earlier in the summer in a presidential campaign. It's quite unusual to go into a convention and not know that person.
Courtney Rosen, live from Washington, D.C. Courtney, thank you. Let's continue this conversation with Terry Haines of Pangaea Policy. Terry, great to catch up with you, sir, under very difficult circumstances. I want to reflect on Saturday evening, after this event took place. There was a phone call between the former President Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley's going to appear at the convention now this week. And Terry, I want to understand from your perspective, can the former president unite his party?
Well, sure he can. Good morning, everybody. Sure he can. And the basic thing that Donald Trump sees is that he's got a split Republican Party. He's had that since the early primaries, largely because of the Haley vote, which has been substantial. And independents aren't for him. How you unify that party hasn't changed. before Saturday or right now? You unify the party by getting the chief rival in under the tent, and you use that chief rival, who happens to have a great appeal to independents, to move the ticket forward. Now, I've said all along that the easy pick for Trump, the way to solve that problem is to pick Haley herself. And he's already said she's going to play a part in his administration. So it's only a matter of question of whether she's the VP or another prominent person within the party or within a future cabinet. But it's probably going to be a unifier.
Terry, following this assassination attempt, do you think the former president is actually really reconsidering who he chooses as his VP and looks outside those three names we always talk about and potentially to an establishment-like figure? If it's not Nikki Haley, maybe someone like a Governor Youngkin?
Well, I think Trump's been very smart by both teasing this thing to within an inch of its life and to not have made a decision before now, firstly. Secondly, I think the three names that get thrown around a lot is like the kids' game of telephone, where everybody else talks about the three names, and pretty soon it's the three names. I've never seen anything from the Trump campaign to indicate that it's only those three names. And thirdly, I think he can, if he doesn't pick Haley, and Haley's still a prominent part of the administration, he needs outreach with some independent appeal. And you and I are in agreement on Governor Youngkin of Virginia as being a prominent part of that. I think he'd be a very good candidate.
Besides the VP pick, how does this change the trajectory of the former president's campaign?
Well, I will tell you that I think there's a huge variance between prediction markets and the political reality. Over the last month, with all of Biden's travails, before Saturday night happened, you saw this race go in a two-way national beauty contest poll from Trump +1 to Trump +3, and that's with margins of errors of over 3 by and large. So, this is still a very neck and neck sort of race. And anybody that thinks that, particularly based on the events of the last month, who thinks that now it's some sort of runaway, or even that it's going to be a landslide of all Republicans in the House and the Senate, I think have another thing coming. Markets can't resist the idea that didn't in 2016, didn't in 2020, aren't now, resist the idea that there's going to be some sort of seismic swing. And yet, over the past few cycles, it really hasn't happened.
You can see that captured in the bond market this morning, just on the margin. If we take a look at things right now, the 2-year, 10-year, 30-year, we're starting to see a steeper curve again. This has been the so-called Trump trade now. We're starting to have that political consideration bake into the bond market, which means higher yield to the long end, up by 5 basis points on a 30-year, up by 3 on 10. Your yield, 421.58 on a 10-year this morning. Terry, I have equal interest today in not just how the former president's campaign is going to change, but how President Biden's campaign needs to change. So far, it has been quite one-dimensional. It has been about describing the former president as an existential risk to democracy. And I just wonder, after the events of Saturday evening, Terry, whether the president can do that anymore.
Well, I think they're going to have to ramp it back for... Yes, hi. I think they're going to ramp it back for a while, but they'll look for an opportunity. The political instinct will be to try to get a situation going where, they feel like it's okay to go back up short of the line. And I think they probably do that, but they will ramp down certainly the week of the Republican convention.
How do they go after attacking Trump following this?
I think they probably don't, directly as they do using surrogates. I mean, that's what this whole Project 2025 thing is about, which is, silly on its face, the idea that Heritage Foundation is going to run the country magically. And the idea that surrogates, I mean, the Biden campaign in 2022 was very good at pointing out, taking Trump surrogates. Congressman X has some proposal, so this means, all the terrible things that flow from that proposal are going to happen, regardless of whether they had any chance of passing or not. I think they do that, and they use that to deflect a little bit, but they still ramp on the social issues and everything else. Democrats are building their campaign as if it's an institutional presidency, so that regardless of who the presidential candidate actually is, they're for the same things, and therefore you should vote for those same things.
So does this put an end, though, to those calls for Biden to step aside?
I think they're less likely today. It's pretty clear that it hasn't been sweeping the party. You know, buried in the headlines over the weekend was that there were a couple of congressional groups with whom Biden spoke on Saturday, New Dems being one, and coming out of it saying that they were still for Biden. So the party, as a party, is still at loggerheads. But what I would look at is, that Biden can still get squeezed before and by the convention for the very simple reason that the convention has to approve its rules before it starts its work. And if it wants to unbind its delegates by mid-August, it can certainly do that.
Terry, speaking of things buried in the news flow, I think we need to talk about those two big endorsements that took place Saturday evening as well. Elon Musk and Bill Ackman. And before this even happened, we had a story out going into the weekend that, according to people familiar with the discussions, Ken Griffin, Paul Singer, two billionaires who weren't previously endorsing the former President Donald Trump, met with the former president to discuss donating to his White House bid. As you know, Terry, for a long, long time, all the way back to 2016, support of Donald Trump for a lot of people was something they had to whisper, something they were almost embarrassed of. And Terry, I just wonder after Saturday night whether it's something you no longer need to whisper.
It depends on who it is. If it's all the people that you just mentioned, of course, they don't ever have to whisper. In a lot of places in the country, though, you still probably do have to whisper. But what I think you can take out of those endorsements are really two things. One is that you've got those folks convinced that Trump is going to run a more conventional and a more market-friendly presidency from an economic perspective. And secondly, I think you can assume that what people like Musk and Ackman come away from is a much more free speech inclined presidency. They're very concerned. Those people are very concerned that the Biden presidency is an anti-free speech presidency. So, what you're going to get, I think, over the next few months is a legitimization of Trump as an economic candidate. Now, final point, though. The caveat here is that there isn't a Trump trade or a Biden trade. You have to put Congress in the mix. And the base case today is still that there's a mixed Congress. So that's going to act as a brake, B-R-A-K-E, brake upon the ambitions of either president.
Terry Haines of Pangaea Policy. Terry, thanks for this morning, sir. Appreciate it. Sometimes markets don't like nuance. They want something pretty straightforward. And this morning, at least, Anne-Marie, what we're seeing, small caps outperform the Russell once again, continuation of what took place last week. The so-called bear steepener, that's the jargon in the bond market, essentially means a steeper yield curve driven by the sell-off at the long end. That's what you're seeing in financial markets this morning.
There's a lot of momentum that now it is for sure in Trump's camp that he's going to win this election. Terry Haines doesn't buy that just yet, but Greg Valliere out with a note today says a landslide looms in their opinion that this is Trump's now election, and basically it's going to be his to lose. Biden has a lot more work to do. Fascinating, though, you brought up Elon Musk. Before he even came out and endorsed the former president publicly on Twitter, we had a story that actually he's also putting money into a super political action committee that's helping support Donald Trump.
Bonds down, yields up this morning. Equities just a little bit firmer. We're higher here on the S&P 500 by 0.4%. Let's give an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Yahara Hakez. Hey, Yahara.
Hi, John. China's economy showing no signs of picking up just yet. GDP coming in at 4.7% in the second quarter. That's the worst pace in 5 quarters and below what economists expected. Meanwhile, retail sales rose at the slowest pace since 2022. The new data showing government efforts to juice confidence have done little to reinvigorate the Chinese consumer. Apple's sales in India surging to a record of nearly $8 billion over the 12-month period ending back in March. The iPhone accounted for more than half of the sales, according to a source. Apple has turned its focus to India as a way to diversify its revenue and manufacturing sources beyond China, which, as I mentioned, faces a faltering economy, plus risks have risen amid its trade tensions with the U.S. And Spain winning the European Football Championship, beating England 2-1 in the final in Berlin. Both teams were level late in the game, but Spain found the decisive goal with just under 5 minutes left to secure a record 4th Euro win, and the first since 2008. It spells more heartbreak for England fans as they finish runner-up for the second straight tournament. England still without a major title since winning the 1966 World Cup. That's your Bloomberg brief. John?
Yahara, thank you. More from Yahara in about 30 minutes' time. I'm sure that's a story you don't really want to hear me talk about. Up next on the programme, dialing back the rhetoric.
We've got to turn the rhetoric down. We've got to turn the temperature down in this country. We need leaders of all parties on both sides to call that out.
That conversation up next, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning and welcome to the program. Here's the price action for you on the S&P 500, firmer by 0.4%. Under surveillance this morning, dialing back the rhetoric.
We've got to turn the rhetoric down. We've got to turn the temperature down in this country. We need leaders of all parties on both sides to call that out and make sure that happens so that we can go forward and maintain our free society that we all are blessed to have.
So here's the latest. Former President Donald Trump touching down in Milwaukee ahead of the Republican National Convention just 2 days after an assassination attempt at a rally in Pennsylvania. Trump looking to unify the Republican Party, telling the Washington Examiner he's rewriting his speech. And he's also calling on former presidential candidate Nikki Haley to attend the event. Joining us now is Jim Gilmore, the former Republican governor of Virginia. Governor, wonderful to have you with us this morning. Thank you, sir. We came within an inch of you and I having a very, very different conversation this morning. Governor, how do you expect the RNC to shift this week?
Well, first of all, the RNC, of course, won't. The primaries have already nominated overwhelmingly President Trump to be the Republican nominee. So the convention is really about sending a message to the people of the United States about what kind of party we are and what kind of people that we're going to be and what kind of platform and we're going to offer. That's very different from the rhetoric that we've been seeing over the last few weeks. President Biden went on camera and said last night, well, we need to stop all of this talk. But President Biden doesn't have the credibility to say that. It is he who has been ramping up this extreme language. President Biden has been doing that. I made a statement last week that it didn't look good for a chief executive for the president of the United States to be talking like this, but I really underestimated it. What he was really doing was inviting the assassination and inviting, I think, other assassins who may be out there right now. When he uses language like that President Trump is a menace, that the Republican Party is a threat to democracy, these things are nonsense, but they're dangerous. They're dangerous kind of rhetoric. And most importantly, it's dangerous because it's coming from a president of the United States who has eminent credibility. When he says these things, he should stop right now and stop saying these kinds of things.
Governor, what does the former president need to say to make sure that he has a message, one of unity and overcoming the toxic political environment that this nation faces?
Well, I believe he's going to talk about the issues that face the country. I think he's going to be talking about the unity that the Republican Party feels about the direction of the nation. I think that you'll find Republicans up and down the line and people particularly represented within that convention itself, speaking about the issues of inflation, which the President Biden absolutely caused by his big, giant programs at the beginning of his administration, when he threw all this money out there into the community. When he did that, he increased inflation. There's no doubt about that. The border has turned out to be a principal issue. The Democrats have just simply not addressed that issue. I remind you that only when President Trump began his campaign years ago did the issue even begin to be discussed. So I think there will be that. And then crime in the streets. I remind you that Antifa and organizations like that were running rampant in the streets, right? And when you then add this kind of strident, hysterical language coming from the chief executive of the United States, you create a toxic atmosphere.
Governor, what about his vice presidential pick? Is there a name that exudes more unity than others?
I don't think I want to try at my place to suggest a name. The names have been widely discussed. What I think I would prefer to do is to remind your viewers of the absolute importance of the pick at this particular time. Look at where we are here. President Biden made a pick. He said explicitly that he was going to make that pick based upon race and gender. That is the new program of the Democratic Party, race and gender. And he said, I'm going to name a black woman no matter what. I have no objection to a black woman being president or vice president, but to name the person based on that rips away the previous plan, which is to name somebody who can be president of the United States. I think that right now there's a consensus that Vice President Harris probably should not play that role. So there we are. So what this teaches us now is that we really at this point have to pick somebody who, if there is an assassination or a tragedy like that, the person can actually be the president of the United States. I think that President Trump has several names that he can pick from, and I hope that he's wise in his choice. Is
it fair to say that Senator J.D. Vance wouldn't be one based on that, Governor?
I think that Senator Vance is a new senator from Ohio. He's primarily known for writing his book, which I have read carefully. And a United States senator is always in the national spotlight. There are a lot of other people who might be picked as well, of course.
We're all familiar with the names. One name that, of course, we're very familiar with is Nikki Haley. Governor, there was a phone call that took place Saturday night. I just wonder how important that phone call was to someone like yourself that would like to see this party unite behind the one candidate. A phone call between the former president, Donald Trump, and Nikki Haley herself. Nikki Haley will now appear reportedly at the convention this week. How important was that development for you, sir?
At the conclusion of the South Carolina primary, I organized a group of about a dozen prominent conservatives and sent a letter to Nikki Haley. I'm not sure she ever even saw it. But in that letter, we said this is the time to get out and to endorse President Trump and to create some unity. She did not do that. Instead, she stayed in. She became basically the repository of anti-Trump votes. And as a result of that, she stayed in, I think, too long. However, President Trump is exuding some leadership here and an effort to actually unite the Republican Party by asking her to speak. And that, I think, is a gesture of unity that is going to be the theme of the Republican National Convention.
Governor, she also is saying that she wants her delegates. She's releasing them. She wants them to vote for the former president. She represents half your party. Does she not? Isn't she still a voice that many in your party look to? So shouldn't she be welcomed in instead of forced out?
I think she should be welcomed in. I think that everybody that ran against the President Trump should be welcomed in. I think you should look to the primary numbers and during the last several primaries where Governor Haley was in the race. And you could see the numbers of votes she was getting. I'm not sure that anybody at this point represents half of our party. I think that President Trump represents virtually all of our party, and that's the primary results were showing that.
Governor, appreciate your time this morning, sir. Thanks for being with us. Jim Gilmore there, the former Virginia governor. That final point there, just a discussion about the potential VP pick. I think we're all familiar with the candidates now. I mentioned Senator J.D. Vance. There's also Senator Rubio, part of this race, Governor Burgum as well. The list goes on and on. A decision is going to be made at some point very, very soon in the not too distant future.
It could be made and it could be announced as soon as today. It needs to be announced before Donald Trump gets on that stage Thursday evening and talks about being who's on the ticket and what their plans are if they were going to get another chance at occupying the White House. It's a big question now on whether or not the attempted assassination changed Donald Trump's thinking. Does he go for a more establishment figure? What did former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy say over the weekend on Bill Maher? He said someone like Governor Youngkin would be lights out at this moment.
They're the four. We're all familiar with the names. Let's see what the pick is, potentially revealed in the next 24 hours or so. Coming up next on this programme, there are so many dimensions to the attack on Saturday evening, including this one right here. We'll catch up with Michael Harrigan, the former chief of the FBI Firearms Training Unit, on the failure of the United States Secret Service. That conversation is just around the corner. If you want a flavour of the price action, we are positive on the S&P 500, building on last week's gains. Equity futures up by 0.4%. Small caps outperforming. The Russell doing its thing like it has been over the last week or so. And in the bond market, yields a little bit higher, particularly at the long end. We're up by 3 basis points on 10s, up by 5 on 30s. From New York, this is Bloomberg. Live from New York City, welcome to the program. Your scores look like this in the equity market. The S&P 500 firmer, adding some weight to the rally of last week. 2 weeks of gains on the S&P, up by just 0.4% this morning. Once again, the outperformance this morning and last week on the Russell, The small caps are up by 0.9%. How much of this morning is just a continuation of last week? How much is it about maybe just raising the odds of a President Donald Trump round 2 come November? Switch up the board and get to the bond market. As you know, in the bond market over the last couple of weeks, it's been a tug of war between softer than expected economic data, both on the labour market side of things and inflation as well. And on the other side, political considerations. And when I talk about political considerations, I'm talking about the prospect of a Donald Trump administration being somewhat more inflationary in the minds of a lot of people on Wall Street. Are we baking some of that in this morning? That's a question. Priya Misra of JP Morgan suggesting we might be. We're up by 3 basis points on a 10-year, 421.77. On a 30-year, we're up by 445. Switch at the board and turn the page and get into foreign exchange. We look like this in the FX market. Not much price action here whatsoever. Euro dollar at 109.13. Just a programming note for you. One for the diary, the calendar, if you will. Chairman Powell, a little bit later, sitting down with David Rubenstein. That's a conversation you do not want to miss for financial markets worldwide. That's the story in the market. Under surveillance this morning, President Biden using a rare Oval Office address to call for unity following the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. Biden postponing a campaign speech in Texas, and his campaign is pausing TV ads. But the president is still planning to sit down for a 9 p.m. interview on NBC a little bit later this morning. AMH for the best part of 2 weeks now. Plus, we've been talking about high-stakes appearances for the sitting president, high-stakes interviews. Have we put that story to bed? Or is this still a big deal for this president?
It feels like it's hit pause at the moment. And over the weekend, we heard from the president 3 times. He rarely gives Oval Office addresses. This is why last night was very high stakes for this president, given the fact that he was directly speaking to the nation, but also not just the former president, but the individual he's campaigning against. And you've seen the campaign already take moves, pulling down TV ads. They're not going to Texas. They will begin again this evening. They're going to be heading over to Nevada, but they're going to have to change the tone of how they're speaking about the former president. They cannot attack him directly. I think it's going to become a lot more policy focused.
It's not just the tone, it's the substance as well. We mentioned this briefly with Terry Haines. For a long time, for quite a while, this has been a one-dimensional campaign from President Joe Biden. That one dimension, I think we're all familiar with, to frame the former president as an existential risk, a threat to democracy. Repeatedly, we've heard it again and again. We heard it in the news conference, a NATO news conference, just in the last week or so. I wonder whether that really handicaps his ability to carry on delivering that message for the next 4 months.
I think what you're going to see, and what Terry Haines was talking about, is a massive shift of policies like reproductive rights, these bread and butter issues that they really feel like they can hone in on independents to come out and vote for the current president, Joe Biden. But that is why they had to pull down TV ads, and that is why there is a lot of discussions within this campaign in this White House about how they're going to communicate this. And that's why this evening is going to be interesting. Lester Holt, his first question was going to be, are you too old to do this job? It's a completely different conversation.
That might be the third or fourth question in this conversation a little bit later. For the last 2 weeks, we've covered it extensively. The Democratic Party has been divided. There have been some reports that the campaign is struggling to attract donors. Well, we can know, based on the events over the last weekend, that maybe the Republican campaign is not having such difficulties because billionaires Elon Musk and Bill Ackman are now throwing their weight behind Trump, announcing their endorsements after Saturday's events. Musk saying, quote, the last time America had a candidate this tough was Theodore Roosevelt. You just wonder if these announcements open the door for others to follow.
Potentially, and we do know that Ken Griffin, another one that's in contact now, an individual that had criticized the former president. Before Elon Musk came out on Twitter and said he's throwing his support behind former President Donald Trump, we reported that he was donating to a super PAC tied with the former president. We don't know the amount, but July 15th, we will get those disclosures. So we can see how much money this individual is putting behind the former president. And to your point, right now, Trump is outpacing Biden when it comes to those campaign donations. And what happened over the weekend is that just going to be the floodgates for more of Wall Street to pile in.
For good reason. This was a story that slipped beneath the radar over the weekend, but it's an important one. I think the most important question I heard over the weekend, though, and I think we all asked it, how did this happen? The US Secret Service facing intense scrutiny now. Trump allies criticizing the agency over its protection of the former president, with security concerns at the forefront, as 50,000 people descend on Milwaukee for the start of the Republican National Convention. Joining us now is Michael Harrigan of the PAX Group and former chief of the FBI Firearms Training Unit. Michael, fantastic to get your insight, your expertise on with us this morning. Can you just explain to me the organization, the preparation that goes into an event like Saturday evening, a campaign rally, the ones that we're used to with the former President Donald Trump, with tons of people, often in the open air. Michael, can you help us understand how much work goes into something like that?
Well, a lot of work goes into these events. I mean, primarily what starts is well in advance of the event, as soon as the Secret Service is advised that the president or the candidate staff wants them to appear at a certain location, they send out an advance team, which starts looking at it, doing a survey of the actual physical layout, working with the local law enforcement agencies that will help support the event. And they spot and identify potential security issues, and they set it up. They set it up so that when the team actually comes in on that day, everything's in place. The president or the candidate moves into the position. And then, throughout the event, they look for emerging security issues that they may not have anticipated or that may develop. And then they hopefully get the candidate back in the limousine and get him out of there. But it's quite a bit of preparation. It includes the intelligence side. The Secret Service has a very good intelligence process where they look at known threats, potential threats in that area, and they engage on that in advance of the event.
Michael, if this is all the advance work that is done, then how is it available that an individual with a gun is less than 450 feet away from a former president?
Yeah, there's no way to couch this any other way than it was a security failure. Clearly, there was a failure there to secure that area, that elevated platform. You're right, a couple hundred feet away. That's a problem. And they know that now. I think we all saw that, and that there are going to be some very hard discussions within the Secret Service and within the greater security industry, wondering why this happened, to identify the causation of this. And I would expect the Secret Service to take some pretty dramatic internal measures to make sure this never happens again. But yeah, you can't say anything about this other than it's a absolute failure there to secure that area.
Do you think this comes down to a resource issue or procedural issue?
That's a good question. We'll have to see what comes out. In these instances with these security failures or assassination attempts, these matters are so extensively dissected after the fact. So we're going to have every bit of detail in this going forward. But there are only two explanations, really. One is an oversight of the planners, the people on site. Either they didn't see that as a threat, missed it somehow, or maybe possibly a person that was assigned to secure that area misunderstood some of the communication, and they failed to catch that missing person that was supposed to be checking that area. The other side of it is a resource issue. They may have had to make some hard decisions on the ground as far as where to put personnel. They may have been limited somehow, because in a lot of these events, they heavily rely on local law enforcement to supplement their limited staffing. And, every agency has limited resources. So it's one or the other. But either way, it's not a good day.
Michael, that's what we wanted to discuss. How they reacted to things as they were evolving on Saturday evening. There have been several reports, but just to ask you a direct question, just to work this through with you, we're trying to figure out at what point a threat was identified and how long the delay was between that and neutralizing that threat. And what it looks like, based on very, very foggy pictures that we've received so far, and ultimately investigators will be trying to put this together over the next days, several days and weeks, is it looks like there was a significant delay, and it wasn't until the shots were fired that they were able to respond and neutralize the threat. Now, Michael, I'm trying to work out, based on what you just said, how closely Secret Service work with local enforcement on the ground, how much communication there is between the two, the tiers that they're responsible for, at an event like the one we saw take place on Saturday evening. Can you answer some of those questions?
Yeah, it's hard at this point to understand the communication and the timeline of when that individual was spotted and when shots were, when he was neutralized. It's going to come down to the real look at the timeline and analysis closely on what was seen, when it was communicated, how it was communicated, and it's just hard to surmise right now because you have to look at the while the individual was up there, should never have been up there, should never have been allowed to get up there. The counter sniper team did a phenomenal job to neutralize that individual once the threat was identified. And you think about how fast that has to happen for those snipers up there to quickly identify and take definitive action to neutralize the threat, because there's always hanging back there the potential. This could be a Trump supporter just trying to get a good view, could be a fellow agency sniper or a tactical person that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They have to really make sure that who they're shooting is the right person that is actually an imminent threat to the president. So there's a lot of moving parts here that goes into these situations. We also have to look at the fact that the Secret Service, when they swarm the president, we have to understand that they're doing so and directly exposing their body to incoming fire. They're there to sacrifice their lives for the president. So individual officers here, I think, did a good job of doing what their training was. But we're really going to have a good after-action report here and really dissect this in a very independent manner, in a thorough manner, to find out what really happened versus what our perception is here just a mere 48 hours after this event.
I think we all agree on that. Michael, thanks for your time this morning, sir. Appreciate it. Michael Harrigan there, the former chief of the FBI Firearms Training Unit. I think we've all got the same questions. We're waiting for the answers.
And we heard from the former president in this Washington Examiner interview. He talks about this. The reality is setting in. I rarely look away from the crowd. Had I not done that in that moment, well, we would not be talking today, would we? A mere inch when he moved his head, we'd be having, as you said, Jonathan, a very different conversation.
A drastically different conversation. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. With your Bloomberg Brief, let's get to Yahara Hackers. Hey, Yahara.
Hi, John. Hamas saying it's still participating in ceasefire discussions. A Hamas spokesperson referred to a previous report that the group would quit the talks as baseless. This coming a day after an Israeli airstrike on Gaza aimed at killing 2 top Hamas officials, including the group's military chief, left dozens dead and hundreds injured. Israel security officials saying Sunday that they were confident their targeted attack was successful, despite the group's assertion the Hamas military chief is well. Google parent Alphabet is in talks for its biggest acquisition ever. Sources telling Bloomberg the tech giant is aiming to buy cybersecurity startup Wiz for as much as $23 billion. The acquisition of Wiz would help Google compete with Microsoft and Amazon in an increasingly competitive cloud market. And Spain is in full celebration mode. Spanish tennis star Carlos Alcaraz winning his second straight Wimbledon singles championship. Alcaraz took down Novak Djokovic in straight sets, claiming his 4th Grand Slam title. The 21-year-old needed much less time to take down Djokovic than in last year's Wimbledon final, which he won in 5 sets. Djokovic was hoping to take home his 8th tournament trophy, which would have tied him with Roger Federer for the most Wimbledon titles. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John?
Yahara, thank you. Some of the winners that Alcaraz was hitting over the weekend, just absolutely unreal. Up next on the program, the RNC charting a path forward.
The fact that we're a divided nation is a real threat to this country. We're all trying to create a better country. We're trying to create opportunity. We're trying to create a safe environment. Let's focus on those areas.
We'll talk about that focus up next on the program. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance. Let's get your week started with equity futures positive by 0.4%. There's a lift to this equity market once again, adding some weight to the rally from last week. Under surveillance this morning, the RNC charting a path forward.
The fact that we're a divided nation is a real threat to this country. We're all trying to create a better country. We're trying to create opportunity. We're trying to create a safe environment. Let's focus on those areas. I'm trying to turn down the temperature. Okay, I'm trying to get Americans to realize that we are in this thing together and we share those same goals.
Here's the latest. The Republican National Convention kicking off later as originally planned, even after an assassination attempt on presumptive nominee Donald Trump. Trump telling the Washington Examiner he has completely rewritten his convention speech, saying, quote, "This is a chance to bring the whole country, even the whole world, together." Trump even calling on one-time rival Nikki Haley to attend the convention, a gesture widely seen as an effort to unify the GOP. Matthew Bartlett, principal and co-founder of Darby Field Advisors, joins us now for more. Matthew, we've got two candidates here, two divisive candidates who want to own the word unity. And I wonder from your perspective who might be more successful doing so.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, John. A great question. Again, coming off of what was just an absolutely abhorrent, horrible act that we saw on Saturday night in American politics. This race, a grudge match, as you said, which was already cranked up to unseen levels in American political history, has now taken yet again another odd turn. It is unclear. We've heard from President Biden in several of his addresses. We've heard from Trump on social media. We've even heard from Melania, the need to talk about unifying the country, turning down the rhetoric. I think, as you said, President Trump has said he's looking to rewrite his speech. So it's an interesting inflection point, and we will see who can take advantage of that.
Matthew, he's going to rewrite his speech, but that is still rhetoric. What can he actually do that would signify he's trying to unify the Republican Party and the country?
Yeah, Anne-Marie, again, as John said, these are two candidates that have been cemented in the public consciousness probably for the better part of everyone's life. It's unclear what can be done to change the impressions. Even something as severe as an assassination attempt, obviously would most people of good faith would renounce that. Yeah, I'm not sure that it would change people's attitudes or views when it comes to politics. So yes, the rhetoric will hopefully be turned down, but how that goes moving forward is still very unclear in American politics.
Which of the names that are being floated for vice presidential pick, though, could potentially help the former president unify the Republican Party?
Well, the Republican Party already is unified, I believe, very much so. And as you alluded to earlier, so much that even Nikki Haley will be present. She'll be speaking on the floor. Not often vice presidential picks change an election, but I do think, Senator J.D. Vance might actually be the pick that the base of the Republican Party wants moving forward. And Donald Trump could be looking to kind of thank the base and make his pick with Senator Vance.
Matthew, there's a sense that the Biden campaign will have to pivot, perhaps for the time being, maybe for the duration of the campaign, away from what they've been campaigning on for the last year, which is to frame Donald Trump as an existential threat to democracy, and perhaps lean in to things like abortion rights. Matthew, when you start to try and play that three-dimensional chess about what may happen with the other side, does it start to influence your pick about who you should choose as the VP?
Unclear. As you said, we have a Republican Party that is unified, feels like they are winning on every issue, feels like this election is a foregone conclusion already. Conversely, you have disarray on the Democratic side. They now, are unclear if Joe Biden will continue to be their nominee, much less, how to approach Trump, as you just stated, in terms of rhetoric, a focus maybe on, reproductive rights, abortion. It is unclear how this plays out. But let's remember, we remain bitterly divided right now. And if you look in 2016, a disorganized Team Trump narrowly won election. So it is very possible that Joe Biden and his campaign, even with all of the dysfunction, should not be counted out just quite yet.
You're familiar with the inner workings of campaigns. Can we talk about the finance a little bit as well? We know, based on the last couple of weeks, that this campaign has been very divided against certain Democratic officials down in Washington, D.C., who would like to see the sitting president drop out of the race. And we know the consequences of that. There were some donors that were holding back from donating to the campaign. We also know some of the consequences from Saturday evening is that the former president, Donald Trump, has been able to attract support from the likes of Bill Ackman and Elon Musk. Matthew, as you look at things and the money coming in, are you expecting a lot more money to go towards the Trump campaign and move away from, say, the Biden campaign?
You never make absolute guarantees, but I think that's a wise take. I think you'll see a lot of Trump supporters, even on a small level, will become Trump donors. And yes, you are seeing some of the big dogs in finance coming off the sidelines, coming back, either returning to Team Trump, or in case of Ackman, now helping, or even Musk, heading up efforts, pouring in money, support. That's a fact. Money matters. Make no mistake. It's very hard to overcome a deficit. It shows support. It is not necessarily, a leading indicator. Sometimes it can be a lagging indicator. And it shows, again, where the support is right now, where the energy is right now. And again, on Team Biden's side, the notion of having some of your top donors publicly stating that they're going to withhold funds from a presidential campaign all but 4 months away from a general election is just absolutely damning and devastating.
Matthew, do you think this pauses the concerns about Biden's age, or does it completely put them to a screeching halt?
I think the conversation has changed significantly, dramatically, to where we are now talking about, an assassination attempt. There was always a notion of, if Joe Biden can survive last week in NATO, and some of his press conference, that the conversation would be changed. I believe, the page has now been turned. The Democratic Party is almost even resigned. There are some reports today, senior Democrats are saying they're resigned to a second Trump term. I think there certainly will be a focus on whether or not, maybe Joe Biden can continue on, but is there really an effort to save the House and or Senate from Republican control? And even that is in question.
Matthew Bartlett of Darby Field Advisors. Matt, great to catch up with you, sir. Appreciate your time this morning. That word we've heard repeatedly over the weekend, unite, unify. So in the language of both presidents over the weekend, the sitting president and the former president, Donald Trump saying unite America. President Biden saying we must unite as one nation. The difficulty two divisive candidates are going to have convincing independents that they're the candidate to unite this country.
Well, Matthew is saying that the Republican Party is united. I would argue that there's still Republicans towards the center that over the past 4 or 5 years have been unnerved by some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump camp. Trump has the base now fully energized. If they were for him, they are certainly going to be for him November 5th. The issue he has now and the potential he can build on this is potentially with a VP pick, looking to a more establishment figure to shore up those independents, that he makes sure those independents come out and vote for him on November 5th. This is what they're fighting for.
Let's go through the names. Governor Youngkin, Virginia. Senator J.D. Vance, Senator Rubio, Governor Bergen. What do those four people represent? What's behind this decision that the former president needs to make?
Besides decision, I think, is what he wants the ticket to look like. If you go with a Senator J.D. Vance, this is going to be someone from the very right of the spectrum that you're looking on the screen. If you go for someone, say, a Marco Rubio, this is someone who is very hawkish on foreign policy, also can speak to a Latino community. And then you go with these two names. These are establishment picks. These are names that, say, Ken Griffin would look at and say, you know what? I had a conversation with you, Donald Trump. Now I'm ready to put cash in your campaign, Donald Trump. They're establishment names that I think could really help the Trump campaign not just look at the MAGA right, but look to the middle and try to shore up those independents they need.
Based on the conversation you have, and we don't know this, but just for the purpose of this conversation, let's say the former president had made up his mind Friday night, Saturday morning about who his VP pick was. Do you think Saturday evening, do people really believe that Saturday evening might have changed that pick for him?
I think potentially. Yeah, potentially it could. And also, Trump is not sharing it with anyone. I've spoken to a number of people, and they've said to me, if anyone tells you they know who the pick is, they're lying. The former president has an idea of who he wants to go with. He's not sharing it with anyone.
We're all waiting for that announcement. Coming up very shortly in the next hour of Bloomberg Surveillance, we'll catch up with Ed Mills of Raymond James, Peter Tchir of Academy Securities, Ken Leon of CFRA. We're waiting for Goldman numbers. We've hardly talked about it. We'll also catch up with Ambassador John Bolton. The attempts to unite the Republican Party, the attempts to unite this country. We need to talk about policy and campaigning, though, as well. How these campaigns will shift, what it means for policy, and ultimately what it will mean for financial markets too. I'm happy to say that Danny Berger is going to drop by the studio and catch up with us as well. We'll break down financial markets with her. Equity futures right now on the S&P 500 positive by 0.4%. Just a little bit of a sell-off at the longer end of the curve in the bond market. Yields are higher by 3 or 4 basis points. Your 10-year 4.22. From New York, the second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance up next.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance starts right now. We begin with our top story. Former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden preparing for a new campaign. Both political parties calling for cooler rhetoric after this weekend's assassination attempt. Trump rewriting his speech as the Republican National Convention begins in the battleground state of Wisconsin, telling the Washington Examiner, quote, "We had a very tough speech, and I threw it out last night. I said I can't say these things after what I've been through." President Biden addressing the nation and calling for unity.
While we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're our fellow Americans. We must stand together. Yesterday's shooting at Donald Trump's rally in Pennsylvania calls on all of us to take a step back. Take stock of where we are, how we go forward from here.
Our team coverage this hour starts right now with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie alongside Hadriana Lowenkron. Hadriana, great to catch up with you. Hadriana, you were there at the rally. You've been following Donald Trump, his campaign, his legal issues for the last several months. Can you walk us through what took place on Saturday evening and your experience of it?
Absolutely. So I was indeed, as you mentioned, at the rally. I've been covering Trump for many months, been to several rallies, some outdoors, some indoors, and it all began as normal. You know, droves of people in attendance waiting hours for him in the heat. There's music playing, people are dancing, they're waiting in anticipation. He starts with some of the similar opening lines as he always does, talking about uniting the Republican Party and fixing what he feels is wrong with the state of the country. And then all of a sudden, we hear the gunshots and everyone ducks, at first really unaware as to what's going on and the extent to which the events that just took place. Will he be coming back? Is the event over? There was a lot of chaos and confusion as people scrambled to try to figure out what to do.
Hadriana, what we hear from the former president to the Washington Examiner is that he's rewriting his speech. What is your expectation for what he plans to say to the RNC this week?
Yes, the news of him rewriting the speech isn't necessarily a shock. He's been looking forward to this for months, even years, of course, with the pandemic interrupting the kind of normal flow of the convention. I think that what really it comes down to is unity. There's obviously a lot of division in this country. This event over the weekend really underscores that. And so the question is how to unite the party, as well as even beyond the Republican Party, looking to pull in the independents. How is he going to address the shooting as well as gun control and the state of, we have all of these mass shootings, of course. So I think that is going to be a big question as well. Again, trying to pull in those independents and continue to rally his base.
And do we have an update on when Trump is going to make his announcement for his VP pick?
That is the big question here. He has said in several different interviews, obviously we know it has to come during the convention. Wednesday night is when the VP is supposed to speak. So we know it'll be before then. I'm hearing potentially Monday, which is today. So all eyes and ears are out there. The same few names have been floating around. But of course, what's interesting here is it will ultimately be up to Trump himself. And so I'm hearing sources tell me, he may be the only one who knows. He could switch it up at the last minute. So we're waiting eagerly.
Hadriana, great work over the weekend. Thanks for being with us this morning. Expect much more from Hadriana through the week from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's a couple of things we've got to do this morning. Of course, right here at Bloomberg, we've also got to look at the markets. There's two things that I think stand out for all of us this morning. Check out equities first. The outperformance you can see on small caps. Saw it last week in a big way. See it again this morning. The Russell up by 1.1%. Switch up the board and turn the page and get to the bond market. This is what I'm talking about in the bond market. High yields and steeper curves. This is the second thing we need to talk about. Yields up by 5 basis points to the long end on a 30-year, 445. Danny Berger started the programme a little bit early this morning, looking at the same thing. Danny, it's great to have you with us alongside us. How much of this is just a continuation of last week? How much is it drawing a line from what took place over the weekend and looking at markets and saying small caps, high yields, Trump trade?
For that, we have to separate stocks and bonds, I think, at this point, because the steepener is a clear Trump trade. The market before had seen these tight odds of Trump winning and said, fine, we can concentrate on the economics when it comes in, which, let's be honest, is bullish for bonds. This changes something. I was talking with Marco Papik of BCA Research earlier, who said he was getting inundated with calls before this weekend about what does a Biden replacement mean for this markets? And it's because the assumption was that Trump was weak enough that just by replacing the candidate, you have someone come in. The conversation has changed. The odds of a Trump presidency are rising. That is the bottom line. And I think this week will be really important to give us a window into what 2025 could look like if Trump wins the presidency.
That's certainly how the market sees things. Ed Mills of Raymond James joins us now for more. Ed, let's talk about this. Danny's going to stick with us through the hour and break down some of these market issues. And what we see is equity futures, small caps outperform, yields are higher at the long end. That Trump trade in the bond market. Ed, there's a belief in financial markets that it's going to be Donald Trump volume 2, maybe even in a landslide. Ed, what are you telling clients this morning?
Yeah, so last week when I was marketing in New York and Boston, it was almost impossible to find someone that did not think that Donald Trump was going to win. And I think after the weekend, that's only going to become supercharged. I think the conventional wisdom right now is going to be that this is Trump's election to lose. What I remind folks is that we've had so many unknown factors that are impacting this race. And I tend to agree with that. But we still have to decide whether or not Biden is the nominee. Trump has to decide who his vice presidential pick is. The number of unknowns out there are vast. Certainly this race could tighten, or we could be in a debate right now. Are we peak Trump or peak Biden? Because as you mentioned, I think that next question we get is how big the Republican victory could be. Do we prepare for that Republican sweep? What are those policies? Is that inflationary? Those are all of the secondary questions that we're getting this morning here at Raymond James.
Danny didn't talk about 2024. She talked about 2025. Your words, 2025 could be the most impactful policy year of our lifetime. Ed, can you just build that out for us? How impactful the policy coming out of the Trump campaign, coming off the back of a Republican sweep might be?
So, John, when I've talked to former Trump officials, former Trump staffers, 6 months ago, they were a hard no that they would ever serve in a second Trump administration. In the last couple of months, they've been, well, maybe for the right job. I think the events of this weekend moved them to yes. And when we go back to 2016, Donald Trump did not expect to win the presidency, is what everyone who worked for Trump tells me. They did not have a transition team. They did not have people in place. They did not have the policies in place. They're not going to make that mistake twice. They are fleshing out the plans. We've heard it through kind of Heritage, the American First Policy Institute, Project 2025. And when we look at the fiscal cliffs that are coming up next year, there are forcing mechanisms where Congress has to act. And when you add to that the planning that's taking place, man alive, the policy changes that could come in the first 6 months alone of next year are probably the greatest that I have ever seen in my lifetime.
Ed, speaking of former officials that worked for the former president, as well as policy, you note that Mike Pence was relied heavily on for policy decisions. What kind of VP are you expecting from this president, potential future president, former president, if he was going to rely on that individual for policy first?
Yeah, so Anne-Marie, one of the former Trump officials that I was talking to said, watch a market reaction to who he chooses as vice president, because arguably who Donald Trump chooses as vice president is one of the most important decisions he makes, because during his first administration, every policy discussion, Mike Pence was there, and he was one of the last voices and often used his opinion to influence his own. So if we have J.D. Vance, that is a signal that he is absolutely going to be tough on trade, going to have much more of these trade fights, tariff fights that he's previewed. If it's Marco Rubio, that's a really tough on China trade. I'd be really concerned about semiconductors, semi-cap equipment, because those are going to be expanded. If it is a Doug Burgum, if it is a Youngkin, those are much more middle of the road, pro-business picks. I think those are where we see the market react most positive, and probably for energy with the Doug Burgum pick, given his fact that he's the governor of North Dakota.
Ed, do you think the events of Saturday evening, this attempted assassination event, do you think that potentially will change who Trump decides on?
It's hard to say. I think the thing that changes the most is that I look at the Trump voter in 2016 and 2020, and they're not the super voter. And what happens is that even at last week's press conference, the silver lining that Biden was trying to give to the party was when you look at likely voters, that's where Joe Biden has been the strongest. And now the likely voters are surging in the direction of Donald Trump. And so I think for that conversation is, if I know that my base is going to show up, do I need to pick a J.D. Vance to make sure my base is there? Or do I pivot to a Marco Rubio, trying to get a different demographic, or a more mainstream pick of the Doug Burgum, the Youngkin, for kind of that middle of the ground, building out that base? Because I think he knows that his base is guaranteed to show up, given the events of last week.
Ed, to that point, we're going to be inundated with polls this week, asking what that difference made. How much can we trust them when we're still absorbing so much new information, not only the consequences of Saturday, but a new VP pick, and there's still a debate on the Democratic side of what happens with Biden and his presidency? Can we really take to heart the polls we're about to get?
So I think that the polls are a good indicator of where we are, or what general neighborhood that we're in. I think people try to view polls as telling you the exact address that you're at, and that's not their ability. I don't necessarily think that they're going to be terribly predictive, but I think for the campaign, and I think for the market, if we do see kind of this significant move towards Donald Trump, that is only going to encourage folks who are putting on the Trump trade to be, kind of a little bit more aggressive there. I think we're probably going to be in a conversation of, if the trajectory continues, how big of that Republican victory it could be. Is there anything that Democrats could change? That could set us up for a potential surprise. We are still an incredibly divided nation, unfortunately. You have two candidates at the top of the ticket that have almost half of the country saying that they won't vote for them. And so if we get into November and all of the polls go in one direction, are we setting ourselves up for another surprise that we have seen consistently in our politics recently and around the world?
It is a divided nation, Ed, but historically, moments of shock like this have acted to almost cauterize a nation, of pushing people towards moderation. And again, you see some of that language coming out from Biden and Trump, as John mentioned, changing some of his speech. Do you expect this time to be different? Is this only the start of an era of political violence?
That is one of the bigger concerns here. What we have seen historically is political violence begets political violence. That's part of why it is so abhorrent. And that is why a message of unity is important. Because, when I was on Capitol Hill and I would travel internationally, folks that I might not necessarily get along with in D.C., once you travel, you realize how small our differences actually are. And that's been one of my concerns here, is that our kind of things that bring us together are far greater than things that divide us. And so I do hope that message of unity can last more than a day or two. And people do have to remember, as Americans, we have so much in common, and don't let that political jersey that you put on from time to time be the thing that defines us and be the thing that makes us more divisive than I think that we really are. When you take that jersey off and you talk to people, you realize just how much we have in common.
Hey, Ed, well said. Appreciate it, sir. You've been a good friend of this programme. Thanks for the input this morning. Ed Mills there of Raymond James. Let's give you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's your Hara Hackers.
Hi, John. Elon Musk and Bill Ackman are throwing their support behind Donald Trump. The billionaires announcing their endorsements after Saturday's assassination attempt on the former president. Musk said he fully supports Trump moments after he was rushed off stage on Saturday. Before the incident took place, we did learn through sources days ago that Musk had donated to a group called America PAC, which supports Trump's campaign in swing states. Shares of Burberry falling as the company posted disappointing first quarter results, suspended dividend payments, and replaced its CEO. Jonathan Akeroyd will be departing the company after less than 2.5 years as the luxury retailer sees a continued slowdown in sales. Burberry share prices have nearly halved since Akeroyd took charge. Former CEO of Michael Kors, Joshua Schulman, is set to take his place. And a hacker who reportedly stole sensitive call and text logs from AT&T said they were paid $400,000 to erase the data. A person familiar with the negotiations confirmed the payment, while the hacker said they provided video evidence of them deleting the data in order to show they had fulfilled their part of the agreement. An AT&T spokesperson declined to comment on the matter. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John?
What a bizarre story. Yahara, thank you. More from Yahara in about 30 minutes' time. Still ahead this hour, Peter Tchir of Academy Securities on financial markets, Ken Leon of CFRA on Goldman Sachs numbers. They drop in about 15 minutes. And former U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. Up next on the program, the Trump trade gaining momentum.
Will this event change the direction? If it does, it's most likely because it's maybe going to be perceived as a potential wave election.
Perception versus reality in financial markets up next. From New York this morning. Good morning. Sneak peek at a price action for you. Equity futures on the S&P 500 higher, firmer, positive by almost 0.5% on the S&P. Under surveillance this morning, the Trump trade gaining momentum.
Whether you want to talk about stocks, bond yields, or the dollar, if you look at those charts, can you see in those charts the conviction date of May 30th or June 27th, the date of the debate? And the answer is largely is no. Will this event change the direction where those two events didn't before? If it does, it's most likely because it's maybe going to be perceived as a potential wave election.
Here's the latest. Global markets ramping up the Trump trade after the attempted assassination of the former president. The Treasury curve is steepening, yields are higher, up 6 basis points on a 30-year. Academy's Peter Tchir has been writing this. There might be a flight to safety where Treasuries are bought, but I would fade that. This attack will likely spur more questions from foreigners where we are headed. I'd expect reduced inflows, maybe even outflows hurting stocks and bonds. Pete joins us now for more. Pete, great to see you. This is a very, very different way of looking at this price action in the bond market right now. Because I think the conventional way, consensus view this morning, is to look at that, say steeper curves, we're going to have an inflationary presidency under Donald Trump, and that's why you've got high yields. You think there might be another ingredient here?
Yeah, and listen, we're so far away from the actual election. We're so far away from understanding what anyone who ultimately wins, their real policies are going to be. I think it's a bit of, okay, we have to do something Sunday night. We'll put on, quote unquote, the Trump trade. You see Bitcoin doing very well, which has become part of that. I think we're going to go back, though, and reflect on a few things. One is, what was going on last week? We were seeing some selling pressure. We were seeing some rotation. We're seeing response to earnings, right? So as we come into earnings, I think the big question is, as we get this rotation, can it occur without selling of big cap tech to buy small cap? So is the money going to come from elsewhere? And on the bond side, I honestly think it's this whole Trump deficit trade is way over. Both are, whoever wins is going to raise the deficit. I think it's going to be bad for bonds either way. And that's going to be the thought process we continue to work on, is that the deficit's going higher no matter who becomes in charge. Why it goes higher might change a little bit. One might be more tax cuts, one might be more spending. But ultimately, the deficit's going higher, and I expect us to get back to 2/10s to 0 and maybe even positive by the election time.
There was a slight bit of that trade in 2016 when it became more apparent that Trump would be the presidential candidate. But the difference that time was stocks and bonds were negatively correlated. And so you see the reaction this morning of stocks going up alongside with yields too. So what's happening this time? Do we need to go back to that ingredient of stocks, bonds negatively correlated?
I'll go back to that night of the election. It was one of my better tweets of all time. It's, stock futures are way off, and I tweeted out, I think Trump will be good for stocks. He's a businessman. No one wanted to believe it at the time. Everyone was calling it. Futures are almost limit down. They wound up the next day significantly. So I think how people react in a thin market overnight, over a weekend, when we're all processing what actually happened, how did this happen, we're still waiting for details. I'm going to take all of this and kind of push it beside and get back to earnings, what's going on with the rotation, and how much, and to me, will people now start taking profit in some of the big tech? Does this add more uncertainty to our election, to the country? Do foreigners start saying, hey, we've been piling money into the U.S., it's been the best place to be, the growth stories there, all this, and they maybe say, hey, we've had a great run, we're way up, we've been outperforming, let's take some chips off the table. That's my belief right now, so that's why I think we see pressure on stocks and bonds.
Can I take that to another degree? Not even just let's take profit here, but you look at the U.S., slowing growth in some areas, political volatility, so much uncertainty. Does the narrative of American exceptionalism get challenged right now?
Yeah, I think we've been seeing that through the data. I think the jobs data is already coming down. I think it's still overstated. I think we're going to see some, continuing weakness there. You're seeing little cracks in parts of the consumer. Certainly the lower end of the consumer seems to be having some difficulty. It's nothing major, but yeah, so I think all that takes, a real risk. Then, as we talked about, I believe even last week, we're trying to figure out, okay, how does the rest of the world perceive this? And not just from a market standpoint, but China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, do they see this as potentially vulnerability in the U.S., right? We are all internally, right? A week ago, we were talking about should President Biden stay in the election. Now we're talking about an assassination, right? Everything's very inward looking. We're trying to parse all this, and we just wonder, does this let us take the eye off the ball enough that maybe someone tries something? So I think geopolitical risk continues to ramp up this summer, and it's pretty high right now. So we're nervous of something occurring outside of it.
To Danny's point about exceptionalism, if you're a foreign investor, can you separate the U.S. politically toxic environment from capital markets?
I think to some degree you can. Partly all these companies, right, are global companies, right? I believe about 50% of U.S. Company earnings come from the U.S. They're coming from overseas. So I think you can get through that. And still, to me, it's really about parsing the AI story, right? Is the AI story still early innings? Have we gone overboard? I think that, to me, is what will drive this market through earnings is, does AI continue to lead the way, or do we get a rollover? And if we roll over, I think that's going to be so much pressure that even if small caps outperform, it's going to be in a down market rather than an up market.
One theme you constantly talk to us about is the rise of geopolitical risk, potentially Iran, Russia, China doing something before the election. And in that sense, you like commodities. What exactly in the commodity space?
So generally in the energy space, I think the energy space is where we like, there's so many good things going on with the energy space anyways, whether it's AI, demand for data centers. We've got a lot of good things going on there. And almost anything that you look in the world that would be disrupted from a geopolitical is going to influence either the shipment of oil or the production of oil. So I think that's pretty natural. I don't mind industrials, but industrials less so, because I do think if we get increased geopolitical risk, it's going to come with a slowing economy. There's going to be some fears about that. So you won't get as much of a pop in the industrials. It's going to be much more in the energy. I can be convinced of gold, but that's not something I follow that closely.
We started this segment by talking about perception. Jim Bianco of Bianco Research talking about how markets would perceive the events over the weekend, how they'd perceive a second Trump presidency. Can I ask you this? VP picks. Can we just go through the names briefly again? And I want to pick out one. This is the one I'm interested in. Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. Let's say he's the VP pick. What do you think the perception is going to be in a financial community when this is an individual that most people regard to have more in common with the likes of Senator Warren than maybe sort of the conventional Republicans in the Senate? How would you perceive that pick?
So that's why I'm waiting for anything to put on election bets until we're much closer, right? Who actually comes in, what they say, what they do. I think there are risks in all of this, right? Who gets picked, who the other side picks, what's said. There's a lot of room for, noise. So I'm kind of down. To me, it's very low on my totem pole right now in terms of what I want to invest in. I'm not really looking at that very carefully because I think there's a lot of time for change, though it is going to be interesting to create day-to-day and week-to-week noise. I view it a little bit right now like Brexit, where I spent most of my time not trying to understand Brexit, and it really paid off because I didn't waste 2 years of my life for a nothing burger.
You know, as a Brit living in New York, I did the same thing. I would say this, though, the difference with Brexit was a global story, became a European story, became a UK story. In America, I think it's always a global story. And that's the big difference between some of the news we're seeing, the developments we're seeing stateside over the last 2 weeks. It is going to have international consequences. Pete, it's good to see you. Peter Tchir of Academy Securities. Up next on the programme, Goldman numbers drop. We'll break it down with Ken Leon of CFRA, and we'll get the numbers from Bloomberg Sonali Bastek. All of that and more. Pleased to say that Danny's sticking with us through this morning to break down the price action. Anne-Marie on top of the politics. Futures on the S&P 500. Positive here from New York. This is Bloomberg. So last week we kicked off earnings season on Wall Street. We heard from JP Morgan. We heard from Wells Fargo and Citi. This morning, it's the turn of Goldman Sachs with the numbers. Here's Bloomberg's Sonali Basak. Hey, Sonali.
Good morning, John. You're walking in with a pretty clean read over from Goldman Sachs. Beat on almost every business line here, but also something interesting in the numbers here. Even with a beat on revenue, returns on equity, you're seeing efficiency a little higher than expected. What does this mean? It means Goldman is ready to pay again. Headcount is essentially unchanged from the first quarter of this year, but you do see them willing to take their compensation ratio a little bit higher here as they bring in more revenue. You have trading beating expectations on fixed income by a landslide, and equity trading as well, not only beating expectations, but coming in over where JP Morgan came in just last week, as well as over where Morgan Stanley is expected to come in tomorrow. A big chance here that Goldman becomes the top player in equities trading once again, driven higher by derivatives products here, as well as financing of institutional clients such as hedge funds. You also have David Solomon explaining this environment as improving but complex. You're seeing volatility become Goldman's friend once again, John.
Sonali, always interested in the read across. You mentioned JP Morgan from last Friday, Morgan Stanley coming up in the next 24 hours as well. What do you think the read across is for them?
Expense is higher for everybody, for one thing, but everyone will be treated differently for them, John. It depends on what you're spending that money on and how it's flowing through to the bottom line.
Traders getting it done at Goldman. Looking forward to the programme a little bit later, Sonali. Sonali Basak leading that effort at about 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Goldman Sachs right now, a bit firmer in the pre-market, up by a little more than 1%. Ken Leon of CFRA joins us now for more. So, Ken, I can go through the names again. We've heard from JP, Citi, Wells Fargo, Goldman just now. What's your takeaway this morning?
Well, I think investors begin to pivot and move away from Friday's concerns, which were the consumer or rates or net interest income, to today. It's really about the markets. It's about investment banking, and also Goldman's ability really to be top in the league table. So what we see with these results, obviously a revenue earnings beat, but we have resilient businesses that are also in position to gain wallet share. The asset and wealth management business, David Solomon's going to speak about the increasing alternative investments, over $300 billion, which possibly gives Goldman stocks a higher multiple, that whole segment. In investment banking, we haven't spoken enough last Friday, but today we are seeing improvements in equity underwriting, and also debt underwriting was a 3-year high going for the second quarter. Lastly, all of the M&A, while it's okay, it's likely to do better in the second half of this year because most of the financial sponsors, those are the private equity firms, have been on the sidelines, and they need to exit in order to get their LP investors into new flagship funds. So I think about it, John. A year ago, we were talking about David Solomon, in terms of his strategy, consumer, retail. Does this really make sense? And they've cleaned that up, and now they're positioned really to be a leader, as they should be, in the major businesses they serve.
So Ken, the numbers giving you a rosy picture, and the market's somewhat reflecting that, but not to a huge degree. We're not even up 1% at this point, and I can't help but wonder if it's a miss for investment banking, specifically advisory fees, just rising 7%. What do you make of that? Because this had been the cash cow for so many of the banks we've already heard from before.
Yeah, so the street analysts have a target price of $470. We're at $488. The stock has done great. I think there's more room on the upside because it still trades as a significant discount to the S&P 500. Additionally, to my point, the M&A that we have seen so far this year have been corporates. It have not been the financial sponsors, which have $1 trillion that has to exit either in a transaction like M&A or an IPO. And we're going to hear that from Blackstone later this week and KKR next week. So Goldman is in a great position where they can be an intermediary to execute those trades. But now it's book of business in the area that's going to get this stock a higher multiple. Asset and wealth management has over $300 trillion in alternative investments. That's where the market's going. It's private credit. It's in these very attractive areas that these banks can take market share, in some cases from traditional banks.
And Goldman has raised a lot of money in that regard. That recent $20 billion private credit fund, out of this world. But Ken, does that mean that this is going to be an earnings season of two banks, the banks who have that private asset management arm and those that are exposed to the consumer?
I think the analysts on the street are, the conversation last week was, should we be in large banks or small? And clearly the diversified large banks are winning. But within those that have a more concentration into the areas that you've just mentioned versus worries about consumer delinquencies and lower net interest income, the Bank of America's, the cities, and Wells Fargo. We saw it with Wells Fargo last week. Last point for me is that after the Fed stress test in June, Goldman's increasing their dividend 9% for the third quarter. They still have some issues with the convoluted formula of the stress test, so they're going back to the Fed.
Ken, we've talked a lot about tech stocks and this big runaway rally. I don't think we've talked enough about the performance on the banks. We've tried to do that more over the last week. You mentioned Bank of America. They'll report in the next 24 hours or so. They're up 24% so far this year. Goldman's up 24, close to 25% higher. Citi's still up by 25 percentage points. That's the bank story. I wanted to go through the broader story with you this morning, Ken, as well. Let's just go through two asset classes. Start with equities and I'll turn to bonds as well. Equity futures up again this morning, but the outperformance is on the small caps, the Russell, up another 1 percentage point. And Ken, if you look at the bond market, Danny did a great job of this earlier this morning, just thinking about the political considerations here, the so-called Trump trade, steeper yield curve, high yields at the long end of the curve, the 10-year up by 4 basis points, the 30-year up by 6. Ken, after the weekend's event, tragic events, almost a whole lot worse than it could have been. Can I just wonder how you're processing the political considerations when it comes to markets?
Well, I think the markets are still listening to the Fed and Jay Powell's comments last week, and I think strategists will be raising their target prices even if they're 5,600. The markets are resilient. We see S&P 500 earnings going this year up 8 or 9% to 15% next year. And if that's true, and we have that kind of healthy economy next year, that will be a great platform in terms of equity investing. Relative to technology, which has done the best, financial sector is moving a little bit below the S&P 500, but the large banks are 17% up this year, right where the S&P 500, but they trade at a significant discount on valuation. In the case of the 500 at 20 times, banks are at 10 times. So we might have a little bit more room for the banks, and I like the dispersion or breadth for the market. That's a healthy sign.
Ken, if you think the markets are just focused on Jay Powell, are they looking through then all of this politics? And how do you explain then a morning like today?
So the probabilities of a rate cut in September have increased. I think most are now looking for 2 cuts, and what that could mean. It's always a two-edged sword with banks because you play into the mechanics of net interest income. Rates go down, you get narrower spreads, net interest margins tighten. This is what bank analysts will say. But if you do that in the backdrop, when you look at the flywheels of a stronger economy, volumes are higher and the loan balances offset even if you have lower rates. So we're not going to zero rate. So we get a pretty good picture here for financials, particularly some of the large banks. The worries are really as you go downstream, where you have smaller banks who are 65 to 75% of your revenue is net interest income.
Hey, Ken, good to catch up with you, sir. Ken Leon there of CFRA on the financials. Let's turn back to the bond market again. Those steeper curves. 2s versus 30s turning positive earlier this morning after being negative for much of this year. The 10-year at the moment's up by 4 basis points. The 30's up by 6. The 2-year is going absolutely nowhere, totally anchored. This tug of war, Danny, this is how we've got to frame things, I think. It's this economic data. It's been softer on the labour market over the last month or so. Inflation's come in lower than expected on CPI. Just last week. And by the way, CPI in that report from Thursday feels like a lifetime ago. On the other side of that tug of the war is the political considerations that could drive yields higher at the longer end of the curve.
It's interesting because Ken Leon used the word resilient to describe it. A lot of people could say it a different way. They could say complacent, that this is a market that has been very bad at pricing in geopolitical risk. Ukraine, those pricing ins of the oil market, they came back so quickly. Even France, we've really come back there. It is a market that doesn't want to go there often. So sure, you can call it resilient, but I think the question needs to be asked, are we complacent?
Yeah, it's so difficult to work out, particularly when you get people in the world of politics and policy like Ed Mills of Raymond James come on a program like this and say 2025 could be the biggest policy platform, the biggest changes he's seen in his lifetime? We'll see. Let's give you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Yahara Hackers. Hey, Yahara.
Hi, John. Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee telling the Wall Street Journal that last week's mild inflation print gives him more confidence that price pressures are easing in a way that supports lowering interest rates. Goolsbee adding he's concerned holding rates steady would contribute to an unduly restrictive policy stance. Investors looking ahead to comments from Fed Chair Jay Powell later today. Bitcoin jumped to a 3-week high after Donald Trump's defiant response to the assassination attempt on Saturday. The cryptocurrency rose nearly 5% this morning to top 63,000, lifted by speculation that the pro-crypto former president's chances of winning re-election have improved. The crypto sector is trying to bolster candidates it sees as favorable via big donations to PACs. And Lionel Messi had to leave the 2024 Copa America final game versus Colombia after an apparent ankle injury in the second half of the match left him unable to play. Fans at Miami's Hard Rock Stadium gave him a standing ovation as he left the pitch. Messi's Argentina went on to beat Colombia 1-0 for their second straight Copa America title. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John?
Yahara, thank you. Nasty. Saw the picture of the ankle. Anyone who's done that knows what that looks like and what it looks like in a few weeks' time. It starts to go a little bit like green and purpley. It's disgusting. Have you ever done it before? Twisted the ankle?
It's because I'm not a sports person, nor do I plan to be. Because of that. It's the only reason.
Did that when I was younger. Not a nice injury. Up next on the programme, we're still waiting for an announcement on Trump's running mate.
I think the three names that get thrown around a lot is like the kids' game of telephone. He doesn't pick Haley, and Haley's still a prominent part of the administration. He needs outreach with some independent appeal.
That conversation up next, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Just to check in on the price action for you, equities are firmer on the S&P 500, higher by about 0.4%. Talked about that outperformance throughout this morning on the small caps, the Russell, doing better than good over the last week and again this morning. Yields are higher, bonds are lower. We're up 5 basis points on a 10-year, 423.33. Under surveillance this morning, we're still waiting for an announcement on Trump's running mate.
I think the three names that get thrown around a lot is like the kids' game of telephone, where everybody else talks about the three names and pretty soon it's the three names. I've never seen anything from the Trump campaign to indicate that it's only those three names. He doesn't pick Haley, and Haley's still a prominent part of the administration. He needs outreach with some independent appeal.
It's the latest this morning. Former President Donald Trump expected to announce his pick for vice president at the RNC this week. Trump set to address the convention on Thursday, with his VP pick expected to be announced well before then. Joining us now, after the tragic events of the weekend, I'm pleased to say, is Ambassador John Bolton, a former National Security Advisor and former ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador John Bolton, thank you, sir, for being with us once again. It's good to catch up with you. So I want to lean on your experience. You've been to events with the former President Donald Trump. You've seen the degree of security that's provided. How surprised were you that something like this could happen Saturday evening?
Well, it was obviously very surprising. There's been a lot of commentary on what went wrong, what mistakes were made. I think it was right for President Biden to say he's going to set up an independent review. None of us are experts just because we watch it on television. I've been a protectee. I still am for various reasons. But that doesn't make me an expert on peripheral control and things like that. So I think we're fortunate that Trump was only wounded. It's a tragedy that one of the spectators was killed. But we need to do the review of this in a calm way. I think do it quickly as well, because there are already conspiracy theories about what happened on Saturday that I think are Looney Tunes, but I don't think they're going to go away until we have an independent, objective review.
Ambassador, we're going to be starting the RNC. It's kicking off right after this assassination attempt. What kind of message do you think the former president is going to bring to the RNC? Because already in an interview with the Washington Examiner, he says he's rewriting his entire speech.
Well, he probably believed that when he said it. Whether it turns out to be true is anybody's guess. Certainly the mood of the country, I think, is such that it would be the right thing to do to try and calm partisan tempers down. And that's what he may well do. It would also be to his electoral advantage. I think he's the image of defiance that he gave when he was shot and what he said since then puts him in a very good position just to be coldly analytical about it. And it would be, I think, in his interest to have a message of conciliation. Now, whether he's able to do that or not, I don't know. But if you focus the argument on what's best for Donald Trump, I think that is the answer. And that may be why he does it.
You've said in the past that you think the highest priority for his VP pick is absolute loyalty to him, the man, Donald Trump. Do you think following these events and the fact that you said, in cold analysis, what's best for him is to talk about unity, maybe uniting the party and the country, would it be to pick someone more towards the center?
Well, Trump doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't really do policy. So for him, there is no left, right, or center. There's only Donald Trump at the center of the universe. I think at this point, it is still possible any of the names that have been mentioned can be picked. I don't think he settled on a name a week ago. I don't think it's changed since Saturday. I think this is a constant matter of reevaluation for him up until the last minute. I always used to say that with Trump, nothing is final until it's final, and then maybe not even then.
Ambassador, one of the historical corollaries a lot of people have used for this is 1981, an attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan. His daughter wrote an op-ed in the New York Times over the weekend saying that her father had believed that she'd been saved for God for a reason, and that was to end the Cold War. This feeling of emboldenment of foreign policy, do you think Trump will feel that same sense that he now has a mandate for certain policies that he wants to push through more forcefully should he end up being the president?
Well, I don't think we can say for sure. I mean, it's obviously a shocking event to be at a political rally, to be shot at, to be wounded, to be in danger for some period of time. That has to have an effect on anybody. But Trump has a remarkable gyroscope that although he has a short attention span for many things, he has a fixed attention span on himself. And I think that using this attempt on his life as a way of proving his martyrdom and the victim narrative that he has so successfully used politically, I think he will use. Now, whether that translates into specific action if he's elected, I think is harder to say, but will he use it politically to maximize his options once elected? Absolutely.
That of political martyrdom, Ambassador Bolton, you're describing something that seems like it could fan the flames of division within this country. How concerned are you about that this is a start of an era that's been bubbling back in the surface for so long that it brings it to a boiling point?
No, look, we've had boiling points in this country. One was called the Civil War. We're nowhere close to that, rhetoric to the contrary notwithstanding. I think Trump could cause a lot of damage if he's reelected. I've been saying that for several years now. I do not think he is an existential threat to our democracy, and I think it's, in fact, harmful to say that. That's the kind of rhetoric I think we could do without. I think Trump focuses on what he wants to do, not on grand historical themes, and I think his focus at the moment is very much on how to use the upcoming convention to maximize the chances he'll win in November.
Ambassador, you've questioned his fitness for office. You've clearly just drawn a distinction between doing that and questioning whether he is an existential risk to democracy. I want to understand his potential to unite this party. You are a Republican. You've worked with Donald Trump. You worked with Bush. You worked in the Reagan presidency as well. What would it take, Ambassador, for Donald Trump to get you behind him and unite this party? Is that even possible?
No, because I do think Trump is not fit to be president. It's I don't wish ill to anybody, certainly not to the innocent spectators who were killed and gravely wounded, or to Donald Trump for what he was put through. But that episode doesn't change my fundamental view of him. Maybe he'll have a Damascene conversion. That's always possible too. Redemption is a reality. It can happen. But as of now, I don't see that that's going to change anything. I do think this event I mean, I'm just being cold-blooded here. This event will politically benefit Donald Trump. And we may look back at the debate, the presidential debate, and now the events of Saturday and say that this was the moment when Biden's campaign trajectory went into a nosedive from which it never escaped.
If you don't think he's fit to be president, is there a VP pick that would assuage your concerns?
No, because we might still get 4 years of Donald Trump. And I worry, and I don't believe the facts have changed about the concern that personal loyalty to Trump, not loyalty to the country, not loyalty to the Constitution, loyalty to a man who told Mike Pence to violate his oath of office on January the 6th, 2021, that will remain Trump's primary objective. So we'll see who it is, but I worry that whoever that person turns out to be, they'll have given the wrong answer to that question.
Ambassador, you have a deep understanding of foreign policy and international security, a long amount of experience on those issues. Can we finish on that? Ambassador, how do you think the adversaries, the enemies of this country, will be viewing the developments of the last couple of weeks, not just the last weekend, but for the issues the sitting president is facing as well? Ambassador, how are you thinking about that at the moment?
Well, divisions within the American body politic are a tonic for foreign adversaries. And I think they're watching this whole process very closely. They know that the United States has a fixed amount of bandwidth at any given time. We've got a war in Ukraine. We've got war in the Middle East. We've got a very divisive political season underway, and adversaries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are undoubtedly thinking to themselves, are there things we can do right now to take advantage of this disarray? They'll follow it through the campaign season, and I think that could be a very vulnerable time, not necessarily for the United States directly, but for friends and allies around the world.
Is there a part of the world that you're more concerned, perhaps an area you're more concerned than others?
Well, I think the one area that we don't have actual conflict at the moment is the Indo-Pacific periphery around China. We've been concerned about Taiwan, the South China Sea, China's land borders with Vietnam, India. I think if you're looking for a place where conflict could break out before November, it would be along that periphery.
Ambassador, appreciate your time this morning. Hopefully we can do this again soon. Ambassador John Bolton there on the future of this particular presidency, looking back to the last presidency and talking about some of the issues on the horizon. The chances of uniting this party, based on that assessment, incredibly difficult. The risk abroad is something we've got to talk about a whole lot more. We had Peter Tchir of Academy sat in that chair just moments ago, talking about exactly the same thing. Enemies of the United States taking advantage of some of the issues that we're confronting over the last month.
Well, look how vulnerable the U.S. is. You talked about this last week. We're at a NATO conference. 2 hot wars are happening around the world, and yet everyone in the room wanted to know about Biden's age and what time he goes to bed. Add on top of that the weekend's event when their presumptive Republican nominee was the target of assassination attempt. The entire world is looking at an America that is deeply divided.
And look, given the politics of the world right now, I think a lot of people looked at America and still had this idea of this exceptionalism, not just economic, but to some degree politics, that we can get through the politics and you still have a better economy. You still have a better place to put your dollars. I don't think you can really say that at this point. We have as much political volatility as elsewhere in the world, and potentially more considering the gun culture of America, considering the reaction. Some of the Congress people who have come out, even VP picks who have said Biden is directly responsible for this. This was something J.D. Vance said. So I think that sort of conversation about America standing above the fray, it's a bit harder to have this morning.
That's the question that Pete was asking a little bit early this morning as well. The question that I would have in response is, OK, we got the US dollar. What else is there? Where else do you go?
I guess it's, these small things. I like how Mohammed El-Arian puts it, that these little pipes you build out, that potentially you sell more treasuries, you start to buy gold. I mean, the dollar doesn't really lose its reign, but sure, it can get challenged.
All big questions for financial markets. Equity futures right now on the S&P 500 firmer by 0.4%. The third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance up next. Here's your lineup. Congressman Mike Turner, retired Secret Service agent Jeff James, former ambassador Ed McMullen, and we'll catch up with Morgan Stanley's Jim Caron from New York. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
90 minutes away from the opening bout with equity futures positive here by 0.4%. The third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now, and we begin with our top story, a defining moment for the history of the country and the race for the White House. Former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden calling for calm and unity after this weekend's assassination attempt on Trump. The Republican National Convention beginning today in the key state of Wisconsin with a new tone. Our team coverage starts right now with Anne-Marie and Joe Matthew in Milwaukee. Joe, walk us through what we can expect at the RNC this week and how different it will be after the events of the weekend.
Well, we're just getting a sense of that now. Again, this is day one, to your point, and reporting suggests Donald Trump said it himself in an interview just yesterday that he has rewritten his speech, and that's going to be Thursday night. The question is, how many other speeches are rewritten? How much of the program has been thrown up in the air? And when are we going to get a vice presidential announcement? All of that will start to become a lot more clear in the next 24 hours here. We are hearing that a running mate could emerge this afternoon. We'll have the first primetime bit of programming here. And if you believe that Donald Trump is a changed man, he's speaking, it sounds like, from the same book that Joe Biden was last night, in a call for unity. And this could, in fact, be a very different Republican National Convention than it would have been before Saturday.
Joe, can you give us a sense of what security feels like now at the RNC, since a lot of questions are being asked about the security failures over the weekend?
They've been pretty busy, I will tell you, Anne-Marie. There are 40 law enforcement agencies here. I had to walk here to our workspace this morning because you cannot drive through downtown Milwaukee, and they have been hardening the perimeter that was already in place. You cannot mistake the security presence here with 50,000 people. It's not just protecting the folks we're focused on here, the lawmakers, the members of the former Trump administration, the former president himself. It's the media walking around this city. It's other dignitaries who are here. So, look, this is already one of the highest levels of security in the country, like a Super Bowl with airport-style security going in, massive barriers around the complex here, and they're only increasing and hardening that security today. Let's take a look at where we are by Thursday. I will tell you that each day that I've come through here in the last couple, you see rolling closures. They try to change it up a little bit each day, and it will probably be more pronounced by Thursday.
Joe, you started about talking the unity message that Trump plans to give. Again, talking to the Washington Inquirer about that. But is that shared by his party? Is that shared not even by Congress people, but is it also shared by the populace? Is there that urge for unity right now, or is there fear and more divisiveness?
Look, you're asking the right questions. And even if that unity is there today, where is it going to be next week? Where is it going to be by the Democratic convention in the middle of August? No one should pretend to have answers to that. But I sat at this desk last evening with Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, known by many as a firebrand, making a call for unity to lower the temperature. We talked to Brian Stile, the congressman from Wisconsin, who's back here in his home state for this convention, making the same call. So look, this is day one. We cannot deny that everyone does seem to be on the same page here after some very difficult messaging over the weekend. People are very angry about this attack on the former president and trying to connect the dots to politics. But this is a convention that's going to try to transcend it. And to your point, let's see if the rank and file will follow.
Joe, looking forward to your coverage together with Katie Lyons of that convention this week. Joe Matthew there of Bloomberg. Thank you, sir. We've all got questions. Top of the pile, the number one question that we all have after Saturday night. How on earth did this happen? Joining us now is Republican Congressman Mike Turner and Chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thank you for being with us this morning, sir. I understand you have a briefing with the FBI a little bit later today. What are the questions you have for them, sir?
Right, Jonathan. Well, certainly that is the first up question. How could this ever happen? As we're learning more about how these events unfolded, it becomes even more unexplainable and unbelievable that this individual would have had the ability to pull this off by himself, that this vulnerability would have been there at the event, and that he would have had access to it and the ability to execute in a manner which put Donald Trump's life at risk. Thank God Donald Trump is alive, and his iconic rise from the stage to show America that he's alive and that, you know, his strength was shown. That certainly plays a tremendous amount of impact on world leaders to see, you know, the strength of Donald Trump.
Chairman, this isn't the first Secret Service security lapse we've seen in our country. And something we've been grappling with all morning is this question of, is it a resource issue or is it a protocol issue? Do you have an understanding?
Yeah, those are two of the questions, right? But on the protocol issue, it also goes to why is it that he was not shot until after he was shooting, when we obviously know there were a number of individuals who identified both his location and that he had a weapon. Then also on the issue of resources, why wasn't the perimeter larger? Why weren't there more people that were there protecting former President Donald Trump? All of those are questions we're going to get to, but the reality is that in the end, this is something that's going to land on somebody's desk as they're responsible, and we want to find, who that is and how these decisions were made. But also how this came about, where this kid, who seemingly did nothing in his life up to this point that was extraordinary, was able to take advantage of what was an obvious vulnerability.
Right, and the distance, less than 450 feet away from a former president. Congressman, your committee, what role can that play in this investigation?
Well, certainly we'll be working with the Government Oversight Committee, of which I'm a member, the Judiciary Committee and the Intelligence Committee, and even Homeland Security Committee. This will go across several, as it should. This is going to be an unfolding investigation because it is going to involve not only agencies, but individuals, and certainly the circumstances of this shooter and how he ended up on that roof.
Congressman, considering that we don't have the answers to these questions, and considering the Republican National Convention is still going forward, I have to ask you this, and I understand it's a difficult question to answer, but how on earth can we have any confidence that we have sufficient security at an event like the one we are having this week when we don't have the answers to the questions we all have about Saturday evening?
Right. Well, I've called for, reassessment of the security plans for both conventions, and I think the perimeters should be enlarged. I think you were just hearing from your own reporter that, in fact, the perimeter is being enlarged. That does make a difference. The fact that you can control the space, you can control access, that certainly lessens overall the risk.
Representative, you've long served this country with an eye on security, even serving as the president on NATO at one point for the U.S. As you look at this moment, how do you judge it to its historical comparisons of fragility and concern for this country?
Well, I think, first off, the call for unity is absolutely real. And I think it's been one that has been going on even before this event occurred. But it certainly is crystallizing in this event. And right now you have Biden, who's looking to going in his convention where his party's not even sure they want him to be the candidate. And Donald Trump going to his convention, where his convention is going to be about why he should be president of the United States, while they grapple with whether or not Biden shouldn't even be the candidate. And they're going to be picking him to be the candidate because of his strength, because of his commitment to this country. And also there's going to be a tremendous contrast between, Biden's failure on the border, Biden's failure on national security, Biden's failure on the world stage. And of course, we all saw last night why his staff say that he should not do anything after 8 o'clock. In that speech he gave, he was short of breath. He had hardly ability to finish each sentence. He misspoke. He misstated things. But overall, he's not the candidate of unity. He did not apologize. He took the opportunity to campaign in the middle of the speech, and he certainly didn't offer anybody anything who wasn't already for Joe Biden, and that's just a few.
Chairman, as you are the head of the Intel Committee, I want to ask you about these blinking lights we keep hearing from the FBI director. For months, he's been sounding the alarm that there are flashing lights when it comes to potential terror attack or issues, events at home here domestically in the United States. Do you see the same concerns?
Absolutely. We see the same intelligence. I've said repeatedly that I agree with the director. I was very concerned as we go into this final election season that there are foreign nationals with terrorist ties in our country and what that could mean for the security, both for our conventions and for our candidates. I think it's certainly a continuing threat, and it goes right directly to Joe Biden's failure of leadership and the fact that our border is open. The director has made it clear that the intelligence indicates that individuals who are affiliated with ISIS and international terrorist organizations have made their way across Biden's open border. They're in the United States, and they pose a risk to both Americans and certainly to our electoral process this year.
But to be clear, some of the threat is coming from inside the House, too. You look at the events over the weekend, it's not just immigration, it's here, it's domestic terrorism. That's what some of the reports also show, Congressman. So what needs to happen? What needs to change there?
Well, first off, that is a misnomer. That pales in comparison to organized, structured terrorists who are located in the United States, who are communicating with outside terrorist groups and organizations, who are actively looking at ways in which to carry out terrorist acts. And that is what the director is saying. And those individuals are individuals that the Biden administration has led across the border. The director has said so. Certainly the intelligence indicates it. And that is the threat and vulnerability that is a risk to our national security directly from Biden's policies at the border.
Just to be clear, are you saying that domestic terrorism is not a concern at this moment?
No, I didn't say that. You tried to diminish the fact that a chosen Biden policy that allowed terrorists into our country who are actively a threat to our country is easily comparable to any individual like this shooter who found his way upon this roof. It's not. The reality is that there is you have the director of the FBI running across the country telling everybody that we have this strong threat because he's not getting anywhere with the administration. He's not getting the border closed. He's not getting these people rounded up. He's not getting these people identified and arrested. And that's why he's telling you, because the administration isn't listening. They're not recognizing the threat that they have placed this country in.
Chairman, I want to be clear. I'm not attempting to put words in your mouth at all. I'm only trying to address both issues. And I hear you loud and clear on this one issue. So tell me, in 2025, from an administration, what do you need to see to make it clear that we're not sleepwalking through threats like this? Again, I understand the foreign component, what you're saying, loud and clear. But in terms of domestic issues, how someone can get so close to a presidential nominee, to a foreign president, again, for people
obviously
here.
Not comparable, right? They're
Sure,
not comparable.
yes.
And we don't know yet the story of how this kid got here, right? We don't know how this shooter got on this roof. Now, I'm very skeptical that he ended up on this roof having done nothing else in his life that is extraordinary, that he would have been able to accomplish this on his own. We'll have to see. We'll have to see the circumstances that resulted in almost Donald Trump being assassinated on the stage at a political rally. That is what the investigation is going to be, and we don't know the circumstances.
And hopefully we get some details as that investigation goes on. Congressman, before you go, I want to talk about the VP sweepstakes with you. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that and you can offer your opinion. Congressman, do you have a preferred candidate? What would you expect now to see in the vice president for Donald Trump?
I prefer the candidate that Donald Trump picks. I think Donald Trump is going to do an excellent job of putting together both his vice president and ultimately his cabinet, as he did last time. He's got a great focus on what needs to be done to change the direction of this country, to close the border, to address this out of control spending that's resulting in unbelievable inflation, and also to reinstill our stature in the international community as a result of this failed foreign policy of the Biden administration. I think he's laser focused, and I believe he's going to pick a great team.
Congressman, hopefully we can talk again soon. Congressman Mike Turner, thanks for making time for us on a busy, busy morning for him, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Yahara Hakez.
Hi, John. Goldman Sachs trading unit powered a surge in earnings in the second quarter. Earnings were almost 3 times better than those posted a year ago when it was plagued by losses in real estate investments and the consumer banking unit in the middle of an industry-wide deal-making slowdown. Google parent Alphabet is in talks for its biggest acquisition ever. Sources telling Bloomberg the tech giant is aiming to buy cybersecurity startup Wiz for as much as $23 billion. The acquisition of Wiz would help Google compete with the likes of Microsoft and Amazon in an increasingly competitive cloud market. And BlackRock says the 20-year-old gunman who shot and injured former President Donald Trump over the weekend was featured briefly in an ad for the money manager. Thomas Matthew Crooks was one of several students who appeared in the background of the 2022 ad and was unpaid. BlackRock saying the footage will be made available to authorities and that the ad will be removed from circulation. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John?
Yahara, thank you. Coming up this hour on this programme, we'll catch up with retired Secret Service agent Jeff James as officials face heightened scrutiny after Saturday's Trump rally. Trump's former ambassador to Switzerland, Ed McMullen, as the RNC begins, and Jim Caron and Morgan Stanley as global investors ramp up the so-called Trump trade. Up next on this programme, the Secret Service under pressure.
There's no way to couch this any other way than it was a security failure. There are going to be some very hard discussions within the Secret Service and within the greater security industry, wondering why this happened.
That's next, live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Let's take a snapshot of financial markets worldwide. Equities right now positive by 0.4%. Small caps outperforming. Stateside going into the opening bell 1 hour and 13 minutes away. Talked so much about this tug of war taking place in the bond market. CPI was softer, so yields dropped. That makes sense, right? And then you've got these political considerations which started after the debate, which keep pushing bond yields higher. It's happening again, reasserting itself. Will this stick? We're up 6 on the US 10-year to 4.24. Under surveillance this morning, the Secret Service under pressure.
There's no way to couch this any other way than it was a security failure. There are going to be some very hard discussions within the Secret Service and within the greater security industry, wondering why this happened, to identify the causation of this. And I would expect the Secret Service to take some pretty dramatic internal measures to make sure this never happens again.
It's the latest. Trump allies and critics alike demanding answers from the Secret Service after Saturday's assassination attempt at his rally in Pennsylvania. The House Oversight Committee now requesting a July 22nd hearing with Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle. Retired Secret Service agent Jeff James, who worked on President George W. Bush's detail for 5 years, joins us now. Jeff, thank you for joining us, sir. I think we've all seen the same map. And we've seen a very small map. And we've all asked the same question. How on earth did someone get on that roof, such an obvious place, and get so close to the former president of the United States? Do you think we're looking at those images the right way?
Well, yes and no. We're looking at them in the right way because that is in such close proximity to where the former president was that someone should have had responsibility for that area. So ultimately, this is going to fall in the Secret Service because even though the outer perimeter of sites is usually managed by local and state law enforcement, it's up to the site agent who put all the security together for that site to give clear and direct orders to those people to say, like, hey, this is your field of responsibility. Make sure you manage it. This roof is a concern for us. If you see anybody trying to get up there, make sure you stop them. So that's one way that it's pertinent that it's a small map. The way it's not pertinent is when you look at that little snippet of map, the shooter, I'm hearing that he was anywhere from 130 to 150 yards away. Let's say 150 just for easy math. Our snipers train out to 1,000 yards. So if you would get on Google Maps and stretch out a 3,000-foot perimeter, it encompasses everything from other farms to businesses, auto dealerships. There's a lot there that they would be looking at. So the situation our snipers are in they are looking at so much land all at once and so much property all at once that it's tough to see everything at the same time. What I think may have happened, and people always have been showing me for the last 2 days, hey, it looks like the sniper is looking right at the guy, right at the shooter. Well, he might be looking in that direction, but he might be looking at something 400 yards beyond the shooter. So when people are pointing and saying, hey, the guy has a gun, he may have been looking over the shooter to what he perceived as a hiding area for a sniper that, as I said, may have been 100 yards behind him. Then once the bad guy pulls the trigger and gives away his position, the sniper engages him and puts him down. So while it is germane in the idea that it was so close to the president, you have to understand that the entire field of fire for our snipers is almost 10 times larger than that little map everyone is looking at.
Jeff, let's put some more colour on that field. Let's put a series of concentric circles and have the stage at the very epicenter of those circles. Jeff, right. Are you suggesting that each perimeter of those circles, there is a different security force responsible for it? And if that's the sense of things, I just want to understand from your perspective, how do local enforcement work with Secret Service at an event like that when they're responsible for different perimeters? How much communication is there between the two? For instance, if you identify a threat, how long before you can communicate with a different enforcement area to make sure that threat can be neutralized? How does this all work?
So you said the main word, communication. Communication is key. So what we set up whenever the president or vice president or a candidate goes somewhere, we set up a command post, but then at each individual site, we set up a security room. And in that security room is a representative from each agency that's working there. So there would have been Butler County Police, Pennsylvania State Police, Butler Township Police, Secret Service, and so on. So if someone from the state police sees something, they get on their radio and they say, hey, it looks like a guy with a rifle's on this roof.
everyone in the security room is going to hear it, and then they're going to broadcast on their respective frequencies out to all their people so that everyone can be aware of the same threat. It's not as streamlined as being able to talk directly to someone, but when you have what was up in Butler County that day, probably 100 law enforcement officers from different agencies, finding a way to put them all on the same frequency is just about impossible. And it's also, you would create a situation where there's too much talk over and maybe important transmissions are being blocked.
Jeff, all morning I've been grappling with this issue of this is resources that the Secret Service didn't have, or was it protocol? It sounds like from your perspective, this might have been a protocol mishap.
Well, we'll find out. And we'll find out if that site agent who was in charge of the venue didn't give, as I mentioned earlier, those clear, deliberate instructions to the people on the outer perimeter, then that is a protocol, a flaw in the protocol. Look, sometimes you're telling people, hey, I want you to do general observation, walk in here among the crowd. If you see anything that seems unusual, handle it. Like you see a guy, it's 90 degrees. You see a guy in a heavy coat, get with him. Make sure you're addressing that. If you see somebody trying to get on a roof, make sure you're addressing that. But if you have something specific that was addressed in the week-long advance that you did, like, hey, this roof is a big concern for us, you need to make sure that you have somebody or a couple of people assigned to say, hey, this is your field of responsibility. Make sure that you need to make sure that you're clear with your instructions to them that, hey, this is your responsibility here. Take care of it for us.
Jeff, the House Oversight Committee has asked for a hearing with the head of the Secret Service, with Kimberly Cheadle. What would you want to hear from her?
Well, I'd want to hear probably exactly what they're going to ask. What were the manpower requests and were they granted? What was the timeline for the agents who were arriving from out of town and being briefed? All the things that we want to make sure that people are getting places in a timely manner, to have instructions placed to them. We want to make sure that the proper number of personnel were there. And I could tell you, look, for my 22 years, I don't think I ever worked a site where I felt like, yeah, we got plenty of people here. There's always holes to plug. And you always feel like, even just for the relief of people, so people can take a half hour and get off their feet, it would always be better if you had more people. But those are going to be the big things they're going to hit her on, are the assets, sniper teams, electronic countermeasures, and then they'll hit her on personnel.
Jeff, it's wonderful to hear from you, sir. We should do this again soon. Jeff James there, retired Secret Service agent, because this investigation is going to be ongoing. Another question I've got, guys, the extraction. That iconic photo that everyone's put up on screen, that's going to be the front pages of newspapers for perhaps the rest of this week, should that have even happened? Should they have been able to get that photo? We didn't know if there was another shooter in the crowd. We didn't really know what was happening at that time. How on earth did you get such a clean photo with Secret Service around him?
Even before that moment, you can hear Donald Trump being picked up on the mic saying, let me get my shoes. Even when he's being hurried off, I mean, he's pretty much exposed there.
Frank Lund says this is the photo that voters will remember when they get inside the ballot box, when they get inside the voting booth come November 5th.
Certainly feels that way right now. Equity futures on the S&P firmer by 0.4%. The opening bell about 60 minutes away. 60 minutes away from the opening bell, with equity futures positive by 0.4% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, up by 0.5. 2 weeks of gains on the S&P, and a rally is set to continue. The outperformance on the Russell, I think the small caps are up by something like 6% last week, which is just absolutely ridiculous. Up by another 0.8% this morning. Note just dropped from Citi. This is from Andrew Hunhorse. Rate cuts go from if to when to how many. Get to the bond market. The 2-year looks like this. I know we're all focused quite rightly on what happened over the weekend and what the campaign response will be, what it might mean for policy changes in the next 12 months and beyond. Need to talk about the front end of the curve as well. 445.54 on twos. Citi say rate cuts go from if to when to how many. We hear from Chairman Powell, Danny, a little bit later this afternoon.
And I'm so curious how this market reacts. You've talked about this, the push and pull of caring about politics or the economics. I think today will be really instructive in trying to figure out which this market cares about more. Powell follows both Goolsbee and Daly, saying essentially rate cuts are here. Will Powell say the same thing?
The 2-year last week down by about 15 basis points at the front end of the curve. The 2-year this morning just about unchanged. All the price action at the longer end. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Switch on the board and get to foreign exchange. Bit of a snooze for the euro against the US dollar, 109.04. But a theme we've heard through the morning so far from the likes of Peter Tchir of Academy. People starting to question, how will people start to think about dollar-denominated assets with the kind of chaos taking place, politically speaking, in this country at the moment?
And it is a real question because dollar strength has been such a dominating trade. But when you think about the weakness in the economy, that started to peter out, saying, okay, economic weakness, maybe the dollar can start to fall. And this is, again, as we get this idea, the bottom line of Trump seems like he's more likely to be president. He's someone who does not want a strong dollar. So does that policy translate to that this time? Again, it's this fog of 2025. We still do not know.
I haven't heard the name Tina for quite a while, but there is no alternative. It's something that comes up repeatedly when it comes to foreign exchange. Let's get to your top stories. Under surveillance this morning, President Biden urging unity following the attack on Donald Trump. Speaking in a rare Oval Office address, he called for an end to political violence and outlined a path forward from here. It's a word that's echoed across both parties over the last 48 hours. Unity, unite the country, unite the party. Who's best positioned to do that?
Well, the other question is, how long will that actually last? So Biden came out and spoke 3 times over the weekend, obviously last night, an Oval Office address calling for unity. But then, of course, he's going to get back on the campaign trail. And you have to wonder if they wanted to shine this light on the former president and talking about the fact that he's an existential threat to democracy. You said it earlier, Jonathan. There's this one prism, one dimension really to this campaign. When he gives his interview tonight to Lester Hall, and then when he goes to Nevada late afternoon, what is going to be the message? They have to really pivot to policies, and that's going to be challenging for this current campaign, this current administration.
Well, he's not even running TV ads right now. He's suspended them, so it sort of speaks to how he's hamstrung and really campaigning at this moment. But in terms of the rhetoric, I think it's important to distinguish what Biden, what Trump are saying, and what some people are saying down ballot, the rank and file. We talked about this earlier. J.D. Vance saying that President Biden's rhetoric directly led to the actions of this weekend. Tim Scott has said inflammatory rhetoric put lives at risk. These are 2 people who are vice presidential contenders.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Vice presidential contenders, which is why people are starting to think, does this weekend change how Trump thinks about his VP pick? What did Ambassador Bolton say? That VP pick is so important because Trump is going to rely on that person. Ed Mills says Pence was number 1 when it came to policy.
I think the VP pick is important from a market perspective as well. You know, this morning and mornings like this are always about perception. If it's J.D. Vance, I think it gets really, really difficult, hard to understand just how pro-business this administration might be. J.D. Vance on certain business issues, and I'm thinking more about mergers and acquisitions and the type, has a lot in common with the likes of Elizabeth Warren. You know, the party of the Paul Ryans, Kevin McCarthy's, there aren't many of them left in Congress anymore. And if you're going to put J.D. Vance on the top of the ticket alongside you, then I start to question how pro-business this administration might be.
Well, it was J.D. Vance who said the only person effective really in the Biden administration was Lina Khan, the individual that is going after all the M&A that the Biden administration has talked about. They wanted to really try to come down heavy on big business. But when you have Lina Khan basically lining up alongside J.D. Vance, that doesn't give a picture of the normal establishment we would think of for the Republican Party.
Okay, but just to complicate everything is the Supreme Court. Regardless if he chooses as VP, it is clear that this is a Supreme Court who has made rulings of deregulation. So maybe there's an element of it doesn't matter. And again, this goes to how just complicated this is to trade at this moment.
It's such a good point. So let's talk about the trading, Danny, and we'll start with the equity market. I went through equity futures and I showed small caps outperforming. That's a continuation of what we saw last week as well. Then I got to the bond market and showed the yield curve a bit steeper, led by a move at the long end, 10-year yields higher, 30-year yields higher. And you said straight away this morning, Danny, and I think you're right, draw a line between what's happening in equities and bonds at the moment. Put equities to one side. That looks like a continuation of last week. It's this move in the bond market, that 7 basis point move higher at the long end of the curve, that might speak to the weekend's events.
But I am really interested to see how equities continue to react, because it does feel like a continuation. But we know stock-bond correlation has turned negative in a way that it usually isn't. but it's not trading that way this time. At the moment, it's trading yields higher and stocks higher. Does it rear its head again if inflation is still a concern, if we're not going to get a robust cutting cycle? Could you get a Trump 2.0 trade that's bad for bonds and bad for equities?
Haven't been able to say this too many times so far this year. Haven't been able to say it since the start of this year. The 30-year yield above the 2-year. We're at 447 on a 30-year, 446 on 2s. The Republican National Convention kicking off in Milwaukee today, just 2 days after the assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump. Trump is set to speak on Thursday and is expected to announce his pick for vice president before then. Joining us now on the programme is Ed McMullen, the former US ambassador to Switzerland, who helped plan the 2016 Republican National Convention. Ambassador, fantastic to share this programme with you, sir. Help me understand your reaction to Saturday evening and help us also understand how you think it should influence how we approach the convention this week.
Well, thank you for having me. And I have to tell you, I've spoken over the weekend with people I haven't heard from in years. Foreign leaders, people that I've worked with for many, many years, friends and people all over the country. And I think the one thing that is just absolutely shocking, but no surprise, truly, is that after 10 years of vilifying and making President Trump a dehumanized creature that is absolutely untenable in the public forum of policy and having discussions of policy, this has been the result of 7 to 10 years of incessant hammering of the president and creating a person that we don't even know. The people who know the president know him to be a very dedicated public servant, a patriot, someone who loves his country, a businessman, a father, a family man, someone who is dedicated to the future of making America great again. And to demonize the president, to call him Hitler, to do the things that were done over the past 10 years, to try to put him in prison. These are politicizing the process in a way that Americans don't even understand where they're living anymore sometimes. This has gotten to a point where there needs to be a correction. And it's very refreshing to see President Biden calling for that correction. But the reality lies in the results. And I think we're going to see the results over the coming weeks. They have to shift now to policy. They have to talk about immigration. They have to talk about taxes. They have to talk about fuel costs. They have to talk about what they've truly been doing for 4 years in foreign policy. And they cannot survive the comparisons between 4 years of Donald Trump and the 4 years of chaos they've created.
We heard from President Trump last night, Ambassador, and he said the speech I was going to give on Thursday was going to be a humdinger. Had this not happened, this would have been one of the most incredible speeches. He says, honestly, it's going to be a whole different speech now. Do you have any insight of what he is planning to say this week at the RNC and how it's shifted?
I think the president has made very clear that this is a wake-up call for America, that going down the track of putting President Trump on the front of the new republic, looking as if he's Hitler, calling him an existential threat to the American people and our democracy. These are the things that are untenable and can't continue. And I think the president will address these issues head on. And I think we will hear about the things the president knows to be true in the United States. Americans are looking for leadership. They're looking for a return to sanity, peace, freedom, liberty around the world. And I hope and pray that the American people will see that President Trump is dedicated to making this happen, moving the country forward in this way. And I know most have, because the results in the polling shows very clearly that the American people are responding to the president's message. That's why we're seeing desperation on the side of the Democrats. Hopefully they will come around. Hopefully President Biden's promise for a change in rhetoric, a lowering of the temperature in the public domain and policy debates will happen. But the proof will be in the pudding.
Well, also, the former president seems to be talking about unity and lowering the temperature as well. That brings me to his VP pick. Who would be the right choice to lower the temperature?
You know, the people that the president has already spoken about publicly, all are phenomenal candidates for the president. As far as I'm concerned, the best candidate is the one that President Trump is most comfortable with, working 4 years to continue making America great again, to continuing the agenda that works together as a team to move the country forward. We have a lot of work to do. The president's laid that out very well. And the people that he has in the final 3 or 4 been talking about have been very well capable of standing with him to achieve those goals. And we're really looking forward to seeing who he's chosen, because I think anyone who tells you they know who he's chosen is lying to you. The president keeps this decision very close to the vest. He makes this decision and no one else.
The other thing that got louder over this weekend, along with the calls of unity, are those willing to publicly support Trump. Elon Musk, Bill Ackman, 2 conservative billionaires coming out saying that they are throwing their weight behind former President Trump. What have you heard? Is this going to whip up people who've stayed on the sidelines or been quiet, not just to open up with their support, but open up their wallets?
So I do a lot of fundraising for the president. I've been raising money for him since 2014 when he first decided to run. I've never seen a time where in the last 2 or 3 months since the New York decision, and now with this assassination attempt, where people have been calling and wanting to figure out how they can write checks. I've never seen anything like this. We heard that after the NATO conference in Washington, D.C. last week, that foreign leaders were praying that there'd be a continuation of the same. I heard very different things from the foreign leaders calling me over the weekend. Presidents of countries, their secretaries of state, who know that this chaos cannot continue, and that President Trump has and shown the world that freedom, liberty, and peace is the result of Trump's Making America Great Again policies. They want that. They want that back.
Ambassador, how concerned is the international community you've cultivated with where we are as a country? The fact that we were even able to, we're talking Monday morning about an assassination attempt on a former president from over the weekend. How concerned are those individuals you're talking to about the state of affairs and how toxic American politics has become?
Well, surprisingly, toxicity in politics is not American, uniquely American. It's going on all over the world. And it has changed. The world is changing. I think the media has changed. The constant discussions on television has changed the way politics run and function. And I think foreign leaders are very concerned about the freedom and liberty and peace of the world. And they know that as goes America, so goes Europe, so goes the rest of the world. Economically, foreign policy, security-wise. These are serious issues that I think this administration has got to seriously step back, analyze how they're going to move forward, and start talking about the issues. This campaign needs to be about immigration policy, tax policy, economic policy. I hear people saying that America is doing just great economically. Folks, I live in South Carolina. I can take you 50 miles from my home and show you families that cannot put food on the table. Uber drivers traveling until 4 a.m. to be able to put food on their table and work the job during the day. The economy is not good in real America. The economy is great on Wall Street. The economy is great in Washington, D.C. It's not good in real America. President Trump understands this. President Trump is the only candidate talking about it honestly and realistically with a solution and a plan. And we know in the 4 years he was president, he was successful in achieving peace, freedom, liberty, and a strong economy.
Ambassador, as you know, you need the right team around you. I think there's a caricature of the individuals that surround the president, Donald Trump. I'd like to talk about some of the facts with you. Factor of the matter is, in Trump Volume 1, he was able to attract some very, very good, smart individuals. O'Brien, I'm thinking of Lighthizer, I'm thinking of Tillerson at the beginning, Gary Cohn, the list can go on and on and on. There are some questions, though, Ambassador, about whether he can do the same again, attract that talent for Volume 2. What gives you the impression he can?
Let me dispel that myth right now. I have been, I just returned from a trip to Israel with former National Security Advisor O'Brien. And I can tell you he is as engaged and willing to serve as ever. He was one of our great foreign policy leaders. Economic policy advisors like Scott Bessent, one of the top economic advisors on Wall Street. We've got some of the top talent. I know Mr. Lighthizer, the whole team, Mr. Kudlow, all of them continue to advise and be a part of the president's team. I don't see any dearth of opportunity to get great talent. In fact, I think increasingly more quality talent is serving the role of being an advisor to the president, giving him advice and insight. And this is a great thing to see, because there's no reluctance on behalf of quality people to serve. In fact, I think most are patriotic Americans who know now is the time to serve, because the country's calling them, and they will reach that call and deliver on that call.
Just to clarify, sir, McMullen was on my list as well. Ed McMullen, the former U.S. ambassador to Switzerland. Ambassador, thank you. Thanks for your perspective this morning. Let's give an update on stories elsewhere. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Yahara Hackers.
Hi, John. Shares of retailer Macy's plunging in the pre-market, the company announcing the board has unanimously determined to end discussions with Arkhouse and Brigade. In a statement, Macy's says the talks failed to lead to an actionable proposal with certainty of financing at a compelling value. This ends about 7 months of talks for Arkhouse and Brigade to acquire Macy's. Goldman Sachs, which just reported earnings, is appealing its results in the Federal Reserve's latest stress test, which would require the bank to hold more capital. That report, according to the Financial Times. CEO David Solomon had said the results did not reflect Goldman's efforts to make its business more stable. Bank executives have argued they already have enough capital, and the new rules would hurt consumers and businesses. The Fed has previously allowed banks to appeal stress test results, though it has rebuffed all challenges. And the city of Milwaukee is bracing for as many as 50,000 people to attend the Republican National Convention, and security efforts have been taken to new heights after the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. Key venues in the city's downtown, like the Fiserv Forum, Panther Arena, and the Baird Center, are the focal points of an extensive security coordination. The U.S. Secret Service is working alongside various law enforcement personnel from across Wisconsin and Chicago to ensure safety for those attending. That's your Bloomberg Brief. John?
Yahara, thanks for this morning. Up next on the programme, we'll bring you the week ahead. We'll count you down to the opening bell, about 43 minutes away, and we'll get the view of Thanos Vamvakidis of Bank of America, Global Research, and Jim Caron of Morgan Stanley. That's on the other side. This is Bloomberg. The opening bout 40 minutes away. Equity futures positive here by 0.33% on the S&P. It's quite a week ahead we've got for you. This is what it looks like today. We'll hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell. The RNC officially kicking off a little bit later as well. And NBC airing its interview with President Biden at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Tuesday, we'll get retail sales. Wednesday, the Fed's Beige Book. Thursday, another round of jobless claims. Plus, we'll hear from Donald Trump at the RNC. Joining us now to discuss this market is Jim Caron of Morgan Stanley alongside Thanos Vamvakidis of Bank of America Global Research. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. I want to start in the bond market and talk about what's been developing throughout this morning, and some people might say over the last few weeks. The curve is steeper. This morning it's led by the long end. It's the so-called bear steepener. 10s are up by 4 or 5 basis points. The 30 years up by 6. Jim Caron, can you say that this is the Trump trade this morning?
Thank you for having me on your show. I think that we can say that this is a reflection of some of the concerns that the markets have in terms of, potentially if President Trump gets reelected into office, that, that clearly that tariffs and maybe some tax and fiscal policies could be somewhat inflationary. And I think that the yield curve is reflecting that. But I think it's also important to recognize, though, too, that inflation did come down last week. We got some friendly data there. The Fed is expected to cut rates at some point this year, whether it's September or December, clearly is a debate. So I think that plays into it as well. And remember that as the Fed cuts interest rates in this environment, which I do think we have an inflation backdrop, it is likely to stoke some inflation concerns going forward. So I would attribute some of this to potentially a Trump trade, and I would also associate some of this with a with a new baseline view that we do have a higher inflation framework behind us.
Thanos, I have the same question for you, but about this equity market. We can put the bond market aside for one moment about those bear steepeners, but when you look at an S&P future session that's up by 1/3, small caps up by a seventh of 1%. How much of that is a continuation of last week or something about this weekend?
To a large extent, it has to do with this amazing combination of macro U.S. data where you have inflation moving in the right direction, but the economy remains resilient, particularly the labor market. And in addition, you have a Fed policy reaction function in which they're eager to cut, even though inflation is still above the target, just to make sure that they avoid a harder landing. At the same time, fiscal policy is loose, and no matter who is elected after the election is likely to remain loose. So it's a perfect combination of these positive, ideal developments that are causing actually risk assets, not only equities, across the board to rally.
And the dollars may be hard to figure out in this environment, Thanos, which is why I know you concentrate on FX, but I started with small caps to ask about this economic environment. Do you have a more clear picture in how the dollar unfolds, how that trade unfolds in 2025 with the fog of not just the economy, but of politics?
Now, we are bearish on the dollar, and this is an out of consensus call. We believe that Fed rate cuts matter much more than cuts by other central banks because they have global implications. And if we are in an environment in which the Fed is cutting during a soft landing and the US is recoupling with the rest of the world, this will also contribute to some dollar weakness. And the dollar is overvalued. In real effective terms is actually at a historically very high level. Now, on the elections, I would argue that the impact on the dollar is mixed. A lot depends on the policies, and you can think of some policies like tariffs, tax cuts that will support the dollar, but you can think of some others, such as President Trump, the fact that he doesn't want a strong dollar, the fact that he may make some comments against the Fed, which will weaken the dollar. See, it depends which of the two will dominate after the elections.
Jim, Caron, is that how you look at the foreign exchange market?
Yeah, look, I mean, clearly there's an interest rate differential component to this where, and I do agree that when the Fed starts to move, that's going to have more influence on the dollar. But I also think that there's another element that's influencing the dollar beyond just interest rate differentials, and that's really the movements in the equity markets, right? So one of the things that, from a global investor perspective, that's been a really strong market has been U.S. equities. So to the extent that U.S. asset prices continue to improve or have the potential or the ability to continue to improve, then that's going to attract foreign capital into U.S. assets. And that's also going to be a strong point for the dollar. So I can't say that I have a strong currency view one way or the other. I think the dollar is roughly going to stay plus or minus within a range around these levels. I don't have necessarily a view that it rallies a lot or necessarily it falls, but I do have a view that U.S. assets are probably likely still going to be attractive to the global community, and that probably keeps some strength in the dollar that might not ordinarily otherwise be there from an economic and fiscal and fundamental perspective.
That is going to be an ongoing debate. Gents, thanks for being with us this morning. Jim Caron of Morgan Stanley, Thanos Vamvakidis of Bank of America Global Research. I think we've got time for some final thoughts. Big week.
Absolutely. For me, it's going to be who the former President Donald Trump picks as his vice president. That's going to say a lot about what kind of campaign we can see. And then also, what does Joe Biden, the sitting president, say tonight? It's supposed to be about age. Now it's going to be about unity.
For me, it is that. It's unity. Because again, historically, and people dealt with this that are in politics now, these moments of shocks acted as a force of moderation. Because you have a populace who says, stop this, I don't want to see more of that. Is it that moment now? Are we there yet?
24 hours away from this lineup right here. Andrew Sheets of Morgan Stanley, Jennifer Flynn of Invesco, Chris Marinac of Jenny Montgomery Scott, and Dan Greenhouse of Solus. A lot to explore with them over the next 24 hours. The team picks it up next at 9 a.m. Eastern Time with Matt Miller, Sonali Basak, and Katie Greifeld. From New York City, this was Bloomberg Surveillance.